The most terrifying monsters don't lurk in darkness. They offer you a ride home. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story is darker than the last, and the truth is often more chilling than fiction. I can't thank you enough for tuning in. Your time is incredibly valuable, and I truly appreciate you being here. But here's the deal. I've noticed that not everyone is subscribing, liking, or commenting. And while I love that you're watching, these stories deserve more than just silent views. They deserve a community of people who are actively engaging with them. So, whether you're watching from the neon lights of New York, the sunshine of Los Angeles, the windswept streets of Chicago, the energy of Miami, or anywhere else across the globe, take a moment to hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Every click, like, and comment makes a difference. We can build a community where these stories get the attention they deserve. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together, we'll keep growing, sharing, and uncovering the truth. Tonight, we descend into the nightmare of Johannesburg's East, where a man named Simon Majola transformed a serene lakeside into a graveyard. Between 2008 and 2009, women vanished from the streets surrounding Bruma Lake, their bodies surfacing in those dark waters like terrible secrets the earth refused to keep. The police called him methodical. The media called him a monster. But Simon Majola? He called himself invisible. And for far too long, he was right. This is the story of how invisibility became the deadliest weapon of all, and how a predator's arrogance finally led to his unmasking. Welcome to the hunt for the Bruma Lake Killer. I know many of you come here to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for 4 chilling true crime stories, each darker than the last. So, get cozy, let go of your day, and before you start today's off, please take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now let's feast. The first body emerged on a Tuesday morning when the sun had barely cracked the horizon. A jogger, a middle-aged man who ran this route 5 days a week, spotted something floating near the reeds at the northeastern edge of Bruma Lake. From a distance, it looked like discarded clothing, perhaps a bundle of rags someone had dumped illegally. But as he drew closer, slowing his pace, his mind began assembling the horrifying truth piece by piece. The fabric wasn't empty. There was a form inside it, bloated and discolored, bobbing gently with the lake's rhythm. He didn't scream. Instead, he stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his legs refusing to obey the urgent commands of his brain to run, to move, to do anything except stare. The woman's face, or what remained of it, was turned toward the sky, eyes open but seeing nothing, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and resignation. The water had been working on her for days, perhaps longer, transforming living tissue into something else entirely, something that belonged more to the lake than to the world of the living. When the police arrived 30 minutes later, they cordoned off the area with yellow tape that snapped and fluttered in the morning breeze. Detective Johannes Kumalo was the first investigator on scene, a 23-year veteran of the South African Police Service who had seen more than his share of death. But something about this particular scene unsettled him in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't just the condition of the body, though that was disturbing enough. It was the location. Bruma Lake sat in the heart of a relatively busy area, surrounded by residential neighborhoods, jogging paths, and commercial developments. This wasn't some remote wilderness where a killer could work in complete isolation. This was brazen. This was confident. This was someone who either didn't fear being caught or believed themselves too clever for capture. The victim was identified 3 days later as Thandai Mlongo, a 28-year-old woman who had last been seen leaving a taxi rank near the Bedfordview area. She worked as a domestic worker for a family in the northern suburbs and had been making her way home when she disappeared. Her family had filed a missing persons report, but in a city like Johannesburg, where people vanished with disturbing frequency, such reports often languished in overstuffed files, waiting for resolution that might never come. The autopsy revealed what Detective Kumalo had already suspected. Thandai hadn't drowned. She had been strangled, the killer's hands, or perhaps a ligature, compressing her throat until life fled her body. The medical examiner noted bruising patterns consistent with manual strangulation, the kind that required sustained pressure, sustained commitment. This wasn't a crime of passion, a momentary explosion of rage. This was deliberate. This was patient. The killer had taken his time. But Thandai Mlongo wouldn't be the last. 6 weeks later, a second body surfaced in almost the identical location. This time, it was a security guard making his early morning rounds who made the grim discovery. Namsa Dlamini, 32 years old, mother of 2 young children, had vanished from a bus stop 3 weeks prior. Like Thandai, she had been strangled. Like Thandai, she had been disposed of in the lake's cold embrace. The similarities were impossible to ignore, and Detective Kumalo felt the weight of recognition settle over him like a shroud. They weren't dealing with coincidence. They were dealing with a pattern. The press caught wind of the story after the second body, and suddenly Bruma Lake, a place where families picnicked on weekends and couples walked hand in hand at sunset, became synonymous with terror. Headlines screamed about a serial killer stalking the east of Johannesburg. Parents kept their daughters home after dark. Women who had to travel for work began moving in groups, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, their bodies tense with the awareness that somewhere out there, a predator was hunting. But who was he? The police had no witnesses, no forensic breakthroughs, no surveillance footage that captured anything useful. The killer seemed to pluck his victims from the world with surgical precision, leaving behind only their broken bodies as evidence of his existence. Detective Kumalo assembled a task force, pulling in resources from multiple units, but the investigation felt like grasping at smoke. Every lead dissolved upon examination. Every potential suspect had alibis that checked out. The killer was a ghost, and ghosts don't leave footprints. The third victim appeared in January 2009. Her name was Precious Ndlovu, and she was only 19 years old. She had dreams of becoming a nurse, had saved money from her job at a local grocery store to enroll in a training program. Those dreams died on whatever night she encountered Simon Majola, though no one knew his name yet. By the time she was pulled from Bruma Lake, her body had been submerged long enough that determining exact time of death became an exercise in educated guessing. But the cause was familiar: strangulation. Manual, deliberate, patient. The city began to fracture under the weight of fear. Community meetings erupted into shouting matches about police incompetence. Self-appointed vigilante groups started patrolling certain areas, though their presence did more to escalate tensions than provide actual safety. And through it all, the killer continued his work with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before, someone who had refined his technique through practice. Detective Kumalo barely slept. He covered the walls of his office with photographs, maps, timelines, trying to find the invisible thread that connected these women beyond their manner of death and their watery grave. They came from different neighborhoods, worked different jobs, traveled different routes. There was no obvious intersection in their lives, no shared acquaintance or location that jumped out as significant. The randomness felt intentional, as though the killer deliberately selected victims who would be difficult to connect, difficult to trace back to him. But randomness is a myth. Every action leaves traces, however faint. Every choice reveals something about the chooser. Detective Kumalo knew this in his bones, had built his career on this fundamental truth. Somewhere in the chaos of data and evidence, there had to be a pattern. There had to be a mistake. Because no one, no matter how careful, no matter how clever, was perfect. Everyone slipped eventually. Everyone revealed themselves. The question was whether they would find that revelation before another woman died. The fourth victim was discovered in March 2009. Lindai Radebe, 25, had last been seen waiting for a minibus taxi near the East Rand Mall. Her body told the same grim story as the others, and by now the task force had developed a detailed profile of their suspect. He was likely a local man, someone familiar with the area around Bruma Lake. He probably had access to a vehicle, as transporting incapacitated or deceased victims would be difficult on foot. He was strong enough to overpower adult women, patient enough to strangle them to death, a method that required several minutes of sustained effort. And he was organized, capable of disposing of bodies without leaving obvious forensic evidence behind. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known from the evidence alone, was that Simon Majola had been watching them watch him. He read every newspaper article, absorbed every detail the police released to the public. He understood the investigation's limitations, could sense the frustration emanating from the task force like heat from asphalt. And it made him bold, dangerously bold, because Simon Majola believed he had discovered the perfect system. He targeted women who traveled alone, who relied on public transportation, who operated on the margins of society where disappearances didn't immediately trigger massive manhunts. He approached them as a friendly face, someone offering help or a ride. He understood the psychology of vulnerability, knew how to identify women who were tired, who were stressed, who might lower their guard for just a moment. That moment was all he needed. After the killing, which he performed in locations away from the lake, in places where he could work undisturbed, he would wait. Hours sometimes, even a full day. He would wrap the body, load it into his vehicle, and drive to Bruma Lake under cover of darkness. The lake wasn't just a disposal site. It was part of his ritual, part of the process that gave him satisfaction. Watching the bodies sink, watching the water close over them. It was erasure. It was power. It was proof that he could make people disappear. But Simon Majola's confidence was about to become his greatest liability. Because while he was watching the investigation was quietly narrowing its focus. Detective Khumalo and his team had begun analyzing traffic patterns, looking at vehicles that appeared repeatedly near the abduction sites and near Bruma Lake during the estimated disposal windows. It was tedious work, the kind of investigation that required hundreds of hours of cross-referencing and elimination. But it was work that would eventually produce results. As autumn settled over Johannesburg in 2009, the city held its collective breath. For women were dead, for families were shattered, and somewhere in the shadows, Simon Majola was already selecting his next victim, already planning his next approach, completely unaware that the invisible threads connecting him to his crimes were beginning to tighten into a noose. Simon Majola was unremarkable in precisely the way that made him dangerous. If you passed him on the street, your eyes would slide right over him, your brain categorizing him as just another face in Johannesburg's sprawling crowds. He was 37 years old in 2009, of average height and build, with the kind of features that resisted description. Even people who interacted with him struggled to recall specific details afterward. Was his face round or angular? Were his eyes dark brown or lighter? Did he have any distinguishing marks? The answers always came back vague, uncertain. He was a blank space in people's memories, and he had cultivated this quality deliberately over many years. He worked as a taxi driver, operating in the informal network of minibus taxis that served as Johannesburg's de facto public transportation system for millions of residents. It was the perfect occupation for someone with his particular pathology. He spent his days embedded in the flow of human traffic, observing patterns, learning routes, identifying vulnerabilities. He saw who traveled alone, who looked exhausted after long work shifts, who seemed distracted or preoccupied. He cataloged this information with the patient attention of a predator studying prey. But Simon Majola wasn't hunting for survival. He was hunting for something else entirely, something darker and more twisted. The exact origins of his compulsion remained murky even after his eventual capture, buried in a childhood he rarely discussed and a psychology he never fully explained. What was clear, however, was that by 2008, he had developed a refined methodology for abduction and murder, and he was executing it with chilling efficiency. His vehicle, a white Toyota Corolla that could have belonged to any of 10,000 Johannesburg residents, became his hunting ground. He would approach women at taxi ranks or bus stops, usually during evening hours when visibility was lower and potential witnesses were fewer. His approach varied depending on the circumstance, but it always relied on manufactured trust. Sometimes he would claim to be going in the same direction, offering a cheaper fare than the official taxis. Sometimes he would pretend to know the woman from somewhere, creating a false connection. Sometimes he simply presented himself as someone safe, someone ordinary, someone who couldn't possibly be a threat. And the women, tired from long days of work, anxious to get home, calculating the risks that every woman in Johannesburg had to calculate a dozen times a day, would sometimes accept. Not always. Many women had survival instincts honed by experience, had learned to trust the whisper of unease that rose when something felt wrong. But enough women said yes. Enough women climbed into that white Toyota Corolla. And for them, that decision marked the boundary between their life before and the horror that came after. What happened inside that vehicle varied slightly with each victim, but the essential pattern remained consistent. Simon Majola would deviate from the agreed route, claiming knowledge of a shortcut or manufacturing an excuse for why he needed to stop somewhere briefly. By the time his victim realized the danger, she was already trapped. The car doors had locks he could control. The windows didn't open. Escape was impossible. The strangling happened in different locations. Sometimes in the vehicle itself, parked in isolated areas, sometimes in a property he had access to, a place where screams wouldn't carry and time wasn't a constraint. The act of killing wasn't quick. Strangulation is intimate in the most perverse sense of the word. It requires the killer to maintain physical contact with the victim, to feel the struggle, to watch the life drain away over the course of minutes. For someone like Simon Majola, this prolonged contact was part of the appeal. It gave him control. It gave him power. It gave him something he craved in a way that defied rational explanation. After the murder, he would keep the body, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. This was the cooling-off period, the time when his arousal from the kill would gradually dissipate, replaced by the practical concerns of disposal. He wrapped the bodies carefully, minimizing forensic transfer. He cleaned his vehicle obsessively between killings. He varied his disposal times and approaches to Bruma Lake, never falling into a completely predictable pattern. These precautions revealed something important about Simon Majola. He was intelligent, organized, and acutely aware of forensic investigation techniques. He was planning not just his kills but his evasion. Bruma Lake itself held significance beyond mere convenience. It was relatively accessible, with multiple approach routes that didn't require passing security checkpoints or surveillance cameras. The water was deep enough in certain areas that bodies would sink initially, buying him time before they surfaced. The lake was surrounded by enough vegetation and terrain variation that he could find reasonably secluded spots for disposal. But more than these practical considerations, the lake had become psychologically important to him. It was his territory, his dumping ground, his signature. This territorial claiming is common among serial killers. They develop attachment to specific locations, returning to them repeatedly despite the increased risk such patterns create. It's an expression of ownership, of dominance over a particular geography. In Simon Majola's case, Bruma Lake had become integral to his identity as a killer. Without it, the ritual felt incomplete. By mid-2009, Detective Kumalo's task force had assembled a substantial amount of circumstantial evidence. They knew the approximate times of several abductions based on when victims were last seen. They knew the disposal times were primarily during pre-dawn hours, based on witness accounts of vehicle activity near the lake. They had identified a subset of vehicles that appeared with suspicious frequency in their surveillance data. And they had developed a geographic profile that suggested the killer lived or worked in the eastern suburbs of Johannesburg. But circumstantial evidence doesn't make arrests. They needed something concrete, something that would connect a specific individual to the crimes beyond reasonable doubt. And that connection was proving frustratingly elusive. The killer was too careful, too methodical, too practiced. What Detective Kumalo understood, what kept him working 18-hour days, sacrificing sleep and personal relationships to this investigation, was that serial killers eventually made mistakes. The question was never if they would slip, but when, and whether the police would be positioned to capitalize on that slip when it happened. Simon Majola's mistake, when it came, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of obvious error that marks the climax of television crime dramas. It was subtle, almost banal, but it was enough. A fifth woman had disappeared in early April 2009. Her name was Mpho Sithole, and she was 24 years old. Unlike the previous victims, Mpho had a friend who witnessed the beginning of her final journey. This friend, another young woman named Thandi, had been with Mpho at a taxi rank near Berea. They had been chatting while waiting for transport when a man in a white Toyota Corolla had approached, offering Mpho a lift. Mpho, tired and eager to get home, had accepted. Thandi had watched her friend get into the vehicle, had noted its make and color, had even caught a partial glimpse of the driver's face, though she couldn't provide detailed features. When Mpho didn't arrive home that night, her family immediately reported her missing. And when Thandi learned of the disappearance the next day, she came forward with her account. It wasn't much: a white Toyota Corolla, a male driver, a location and approximate time. But it was more than the task force had gotten from any previous abduction. Detective Khumalo felt the first spark of real hope. They could work with this. They could cross-reference this information with their existing data, narrow down the universe of possible suspects. The white Toyota Corolla became their primary focus. How many such vehicles operated in the informal taxi network in eastern Johannesburg? How many of those had appeared in their traffic analysis near both abduction sites and Bruma Lake? The list was long initially, dozens of potential matches. But the task force began the patient work of elimination, interviewing drivers, checking alibis, looking for anything that would elevate someone from possible to probable. Simon Majola's name appeared on that list. His vehicle matched. His routes put him in the right areas at the right times. But so did many others. What distinguished Simon Majola, what eventually drew focused attention to him, was his behavior during the initial interview. Most of the drivers they spoke to were cooperative, if sometimes annoyed by the intrusion. They answered questions, provided documentation, accepted the inconvenience as part of living in a city plagued by crime. Simon Majola was cooperative too, but there was something else beneath his compliance. Detective Khumalo, who had spent decades reading people, sensed it immediately. A watchfulness, a calculation happening behind Majola's eyes. He was measuring every word, evaluating every question, playing a game within the interview. It was the performance of innocence rather than the reality of it. And Detective Khumalo had seen this performance before. They placed Simon Majola under surveillance. Not the obvious kind, no cars following him, no uniformed officers loitering near his home. Instead, they tracked his movements through traffic cameras, cell phone data, the digital footprints that everyone leaves in the modern world. They watched where he went, who he interacted with when he deviated from normal patterns. And they waited, because Detective Khumalo understood something crucial about predators like Simon Majola. They couldn't stop. The compulsion that drove them was too powerful, too deeply embedded in their psychology. Simon Majola would kill again. The only questions were when and whether the police would be ready. Mpho Sithole's body surfaced in Bruma Lake 8 days after her disappearance. The same method, the same location, the same signature. Her death brought the confirmed victim count to 5, though Detective Khumalo suspected there might be others. Women whose bodies had never been found or whose deaths had never been connected to the series. The city's fear had evolved into something approaching panic. Political pressure on the police intensified. Media coverage grew more sensational and critical. And through it all, Simon Majola continued his daily routine, driving his taxi, interacting with passengers, presenting the face of normalcy to the world while his thoughts circled endlessly around his next hunt, his next kill, his next deposit in the dark waters of Bruma Lake. He believed himself untouchable. He had killed 5 women and evaded capture. He had read every article, absorbed every detail of the investigation, and found nothing that suggested the police were close to identifying him. His confidence swelled into arrogance, and arrogance would prove to be the crack in his armor. Because Simon Majola decided to take a trophy. The trophy was a photograph, not the kind a killer might typically take. No gruesome documentation of the crime itself, no mementos captured in the moment of death. This was something more mundane, more easily overlooked, and for that reason more dangerous. It was a photo from Mpho Sithole's identification document, which Simon Majola had removed from her purse before disposing of her body. He kept it folded in his wallet, a secret talisman of his power, a reminder that he had made another human being disappear. Trophy taking is a common behavior among serial offenders. It serves multiple psychological purposes. It allows the killer to relive the crime during the interim between murders. It provides a sense of accomplishment and ownership, and it feeds the ego by creating tangible proof of successfully executed kills. But trophies are also liabilities. They're physical evidence that can connect a suspect to a victim. They're the kind of mistake that investigative teams pray for. Simon Majola kept that photograph for 3 weeks before circumstances conspired to betray him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A woman named Zadwa Makais, 31 years old, was waiting at a taxi rank in Bedfordview on a Tuesday evening in late April when a white Toyota Corolla pulled up beside her. The driver, Simon Majola, though she didn't know his name, rolled down his window and offered her a lift. Something about him triggered Zadwa's instincts. Maybe it was the way he looked at her. Maybe it was the forced casualness of his tone. Maybe it was just the accumulated wisdom of being a woman navigating dangerous spaces. Whatever the source, she felt alarm bells ringing in her nervous system. She declined politely and turned away. But Simon Majola persisted, calling after her, adjusting his approach, trying different angles of persuasion. And this persistence, which reflected his growing desperation, his need to kill again, drew the attention of other people at the taxi rank. A security guard employed by a nearby shopping center noticed the interaction and found it troubling. When Zadwa explained that the driver was making her uncomfortable, the security guard approached the vehicle and took note of its registration plate. Simon Majola drove away. He didn't get his victim that day, and in that moment of frustrated desire, he made a critical error. He returned to familiar ground. Surveillance footage would later show his vehicle in the vicinity of Bruma Lake that same evening, driving slowly along the access roads, circling his dumping ground like a compulsion he couldn't resist. He wasn't disposing of a body. He had no body to dispose. He was simply drawn there, pulled by the psychological weight the location held for him. Detective Kumalo received the security guard's report the following day. A white Toyota Corolla, acting suspiciously, making aggressive approaches to a potential victim at a taxi rank in Bedfordview. The registration number matched a vehicle already on their surveillance list, Simon Majola's. The pieces began assembling with increasing speed. They pulled detailed records of Simon Majola's movements over the previous months, constructing a timeline that aligned with stunning precision to their window of offenses. They interviewed people who knew him, building a portrait of a man who lived alone, who had few close relationships, who kept to himself in ways that suggested concealment rather than mere privacy. They learned he had access to a backyard room in a property in Malvern, a space he rented cheaply and where he could come and go without oversight. They obtained a search warrant. Detective Kumalo assembled a team, and on the morning of May 7, 2009, they descended on Simon Majola's residence. He wasn't home when they arrived. He was already out driving his taxi route, beginning another day of hunting. But his space revealed the secrets he had worked so hard to hide. The backyard room was sparsely furnished. A single bed, a small table, a cupboard containing minimal clothing. But in the cupboard, tucked inside an old shoebox, investigators found a collection that made Detective Kumalo's blood run cold. Photographs, identification documents, small personal items belonging to different women. Mfo Sithol's ID photo was there. So was Lindayo Radibi's library card, a hair clip that would later be identified as belonging to Thandayo Mlongo. Each item represented a life taken, a person erased, a family destroyed. They also found rope in his vehicle, the same type of rope that forensic analysis had suggested might have been used in at least 2 of the strangulations. They found cleaning supplies that suggested obsessive decontamination practices. They found maps with routes marked with locations circled, including multiple marks around Bruma Lake. When Simon Majola returned that evening, police were waiting. They arrested him without incident. He didn't resist, didn't protest his innocence, didn't demand to know what this was about. Instead, he seemed to deflate, as though some internal structure that had been holding him upright had suddenly collapsed. The mask of normalcy fell away, revealing the void beneath. His interrogation began that same night. Detective Khumalo sat across from him in the small interview room, separated by a table scarred with years of use. Simon Majola stared at his hands, his expression neutral, his body language withdrawn. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately, which was itself telling. He wanted to talk. Some part of him, the part that had been carrying this enormous secret alone for so long, wanted to finally speak it aloud. "We found the photographs," Detective Khumalo said, his voice level and controlled. "We found the personal items. We know what you did." Simon Majola looked up, and for the first time, Detective Khumalo saw something flicker behind his eyes. Not remorse, not shame, something closer to pride. "Do you know how careful I was?" Simon Majola said, his voice quiet but clear. "How much planning went into each one. They were teaching you people about me, but you couldn't see. You couldn't understand." It was a confession wrapped in arrogance. The words of someone who believed his cleverness deserved recognition even as it led to his capture. Detective Khumalo felt disgust rise in his throat but kept his expression neutral. This was the moment investigators lived for. The moment when the perpetrator's ego overrode their self-preservation instinct and they couldn't resist explaining, boasting, revealing. Over the next several hours, Simon Majola talked. He described how he selected victims, how he approached them, how he murdered them. He walked investigators through each killing with clinical detachment, as though discussing a craft he had mastered. He confirmed 5 victims, the 5 whose bodies had been recovered from Bruma Lake. But he also hinted at others, at women who had disappeared before he perfected his disposal method, women whose bodies might be elsewhere or might never be found. He explained why he chose Bruma Lake. It was close enough to be convenient, isolated enough during certain hours to allow undisturbed disposal, and deep enough that bodies took time to surface. He described the satisfaction he felt watching the bodies sink, watching the water close over them. He talked about the sense of power that came from making people disappear, from being the cause of the desperate searches and the tearful appeals from families, all while moving undetected through society. What he didn't express, what he seemed constitutionally incapable of expressing, was empathy. The women he killed weren't real to him as human beings with interior lives, with dreams and fears and people who loved them. They were objects. They were instruments for satisfying his pathological needs. They were disposable. Detective Khumalo listened to it all, taking detailed notes, recording every word. This confession would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. But more than that, it would provide answers to the families who had spent months not knowing what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. Those answers wouldn't bring comfort, how could they? But they would at least replace the terrible uncertainty with terrible truth. As dawn broke over Johannesburg on May 8, 2009, Simon Majola was formally charged with 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, and a litany of associated crimes. The media erupted with the news of his arrest. The city exhaled in relief mixed with rage. And at Bruma Lake, where the sun now rose over waters that had hidden so many dark secrets, police divers began searching for any remaining evidence, any other victims, any final pieces of the horror that Simon Majola had inflicted on the world. The investigation wasn't over. There would be months of additional work, of confirming details, of building an airtight case. There would be questions about whether he had accomplices. The media had speculated about killers plural in some early reports, though evidence increasingly pointed to a sole perpetrator. There would be forensic analysis, witness preparation, legal maneuvering. But the central mystery had been solved. The Bruma Lake killer had a name and a face. The monster was no longer invisible. The trial of Simon Majola began in October 2010, 18 months after his arrest. The intervening time had been consumed by legal proceedings, psychological evaluations, and the painstaking construction of a prosecution case that would leave no room for doubt. The state assembled overwhelming evidence. The trophies found in Majola's possession, his detailed confession, forensic connections between his vehicle and victims, witness testimony placing him at or near abduction sites, and the damning timeline that showed his movements correlating with every single disappearance. The courtroom was packed for the opening day. Families of the victims filled the front rows, their faces etched with grief that had calcified over the long months of waiting. Members of the media jostled for space, their cameras and recording devices ready to capture every moment of what promised to be one of Johannesburg's most significant murder trials. And amid this crowd, Simon Majola sat in the dock, looking smaller somehow than he had during the height of his predation. Prison had drained some quality from him, or perhaps it was simply that without the power to hunt, to kill, to disappear women into dark water, he had lost the internal force that had previously animated him. His defense attorney, a public defender assigned to the case, faced an impossible task. The evidence was insurmountable. The confession was clear and detailed. There was no plausible alternative narrative, no reasonable doubt to exploit. The best strategy available was to argue for mitigation, to present psychological testimony suggesting diminished capacity, to paint Majola as someone whose actions were driven by mental illness rather than pure malevolence. It was a strategy born of desperation, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The prosecution, led by senior state advocate Nambula Dubé, methodically presented their case over the course of 6 weeks. They called Detective Kimalo to the stand, where he walked the court through the investigation from those first terrible discoveries at Bruma Lake through to the final arrest. They called forensic experts who testified about strangulation patterns, about the condition of the bodies, about the evidence recovered from Majola's room and vehicle. They called Thandi, Mfo Sithol's friend, who described watching Mfo climb into a white Toyota Corolla and never seeing her alive again. And they called the families. One by one, relatives of the deceased took the stand to testify about who these women had been before Simon Majola destroyed them. Thandi Mlongo's mother spoke about her daughter's dreams of opening a hair salon, about the notebook where she had sketched out business plans and calculated costs. Namsa Dlamini's children, now being raised by their grandmother, were present but didn't testify, their small faces confused and sad as proceedings swirled around them. Precious Ndlovu's father, his voice breaking repeatedly, described the last conversation he'd had with his daughter, how she'd called him from work to say she would be home soon for dinner, how he'd set her place at the table and watched it remain empty as hours became days became weeks. These testimonies served a crucial purpose beyond their evidentiary value. They humanized the victims, transformed them from abstract entries in court documents into real people whose absence had created irreparable holes in the fabric of their families and communities. They forced everyone in the courtroom, including Simon Majola, though his expression remained largely impassive, to confront the full weight of what had been taken. The most devastating moment of the trial came when the prosecution played portions of Majola's confession. His voice, recorded in that interrogation room months earlier, filled the courtroom with clinical descriptions of murder. When he described strangling Thandi Mlongo, her mother collapsed and had to be helped from the courtroom. When he discussed disposing of Mfo Sithol's body in the lake, audible sobs echoed from the gallery. The judge called several recesses to allow people to compose themselves, but the emotional toll was inescapable. Simon Majola's defense team presented their case in a single week. They called a psychiatrist who testified that Majola displayed characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by lack of empathy, disregard for others, and inability to form normal emotional connections. The psychiatrist carefully outlined the diagnostic criteria, explained how Majola's behavior fit the pattern, and suggested that this mental disorder had driven his actions. But the prosecution's cross-examination dismantled this argument efficiently. Advocate Dubé pointed out that antisocial personality disorder did not preclude understanding right from wrong. She noted that Majola had taken extensive precautions to avoid capture, demonstrating clear awareness that his actions were illegal and would result in punishment if discovered. She highlighted his confession, where he expressed pride in his ability to evade detection, pride that indicated conscious choice rather than compelled action driven by uncontrollable impulses. He knew what he was doing, Advocate Dubé told the court during closing arguments. He planned it, he executed it, he took pleasure from it, and he worked very hard to avoid the consequences. This is not the profile of someone who lacked capacity to distinguish right from wrong. This is the profile of someone who understood the difference perfectly well and simply chose wrong. Repeatedly, deliberately, fatally. The defense's closing argument was brief and formulaic, acknowledging the horror of the crimes, while requesting that the court consider Majola's mental state as a mitigating factor in sentencing. It was an argument that convinced no one. The judge, Justice Thambile Sithole, a veteran jurist with a reputation for fairness and measured consideration, took 3 days to deliver his verdict. When the court reconvened on December 2nd, 2010, the tension was suffocating. Justice Sithole began by summarizing the evidence, a process that took more than an hour. He addressed each charge individually, walking through the elements the state needed to prove and the evidence that satisfied those elements. And then, with the weight of his office and the gravity of the moment evident in every word, he delivered his findings. Guilty on all charges. 5 counts of murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, additional convictions for illegal possession of victims' property. The verdicts came in measured cadence, each one landing like a hammer blow. In the gallery, family members wept, tears of grief, tears of relief, tears of rage that no verdict could truly address. Sentencing occurred a week later. Justice Sithole had reviewed pre-sentence reports, victim impact statements, and psychological evaluations. When he took his seat to deliver the sentence, the courtroom fell into absolute silence, the kind of quiet that feels almost physical in its intensity. Simon Majola, Justice Sithole began, his voice resonant and unwavering. You have been found guilty of crimes that shake the foundations of our society. You systematically hunted, terrorized, and murdered 5 women whose only mistake was crossing your path. You exploited their vulnerability, their exhaustion, their basic human need to trust that not everyone is a predator. You strangled the life from them with your own hands, an act that required sustained effort, sustained commitment to ending another person's existence. And then you disposed of their bodies as though they were refuse, dumping them in Bruma Lake with no more consideration than one might give to discarding trash. Justice Sithole paused, his gaze fixed on Majola, who sat motionless in the dock. The evidence before this court reveals a pattern of behavior that was methodical, calculated, and utterly devoid of human compassion. You took trophies from your victims, photographs, identification documents, personal items, not as reminders of their humanity, but as souvenirs of your power over them. You confessed to these crimes with an air of pride, as though your ability to evade detection for months was an accomplishment deserving recognition rather than a tragedy that cost innocent lives. The judge's voice grew harder, each word precisely weighted. This court has considered whether there are any substantial and compelling circumstances that would justify deviation from the prescribed sentence for these offenses. I have examined your background, your psychological state, your lack of prior criminal convictions. But I find nothing that mitigates the severity of what you have done. You knew right from wrong. You understood the consequences of your actions. You simply chose to prioritize your own pathological desires over the lives and well-being of others. Justice Sithole leaned forward slightly. The families represented in this courtroom will never recover from what you took from them. Thandai Mlongo will never open the hair salon she dreamed about. Namsa Dlamini's children will grow up without their mother. Precious Ndlovu will never become the nurse she wanted to be. Lindayo Radebe and Mfo Sithole will never experience the futures that should have been theirs. You erased their possibilities. You destroyed their families. You created a wound in this community that will never fully heal. The sentence, when it came, was delivered without theatrical pause or dramatic emphasis. Justice Sithole's tone remained level, professional, final. On each of the 5 counts of murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment. These sentences are to run concurrently. However, this court further orders that you shall not be eligible for parole consideration until you have served a minimum of 35 years of your sentence. Additionally, on the charges of kidnapping and related offenses, you are sentenced to an additional 15 years, to run consecutively to the life sentences. The mathematics of it meant that Simon Majola, then 39 years old, would be in his mid-70s before he could even be considered for parole. And given the nature of his crimes, given the absence of any genuine remorse, the likelihood of parole being granted even then was virtually non-existent. For all practical purposes, Simon Majola would die in prison. There was no outburst from Majola, no protest, no breakdown, no final statement. He simply stood when instructed, his expression blank, and allowed himself to be led from the courtroom by correctional officers. As he disappeared through the door that would take him back to prison, back to the cell where he would spend the remainder of his life, the families in the gallery embraced each other, their emotions too complex for simple description. Detective Kumalo, sitting near the back of the courtroom, felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The investigation had consumed nearly 2 years of his life, had cost him sleep and relationships and pieces of his faith in humanity. But it was done. The monster had been caged. The families had their answers, however terrible those answers might be. The story of Simon Majola and the Bruma Lake murders didn't end with his conviction. It rippled outward, affecting the community and the city in ways both visible and subtle. Bruma Lake itself became a site of memorial. In the months following the trial, families of the victims, along with community activists and women's rights organizations, erected a small monument near the water's edge. 5 stones, each bearing a name: Thandai Umlongo, Namsa Dlamini, Precious Ndlovu, Lindai Radebe, Mfo Sithole. The inscription below their names read simply, "Never forgotten, never again." The monument became a place of pilgrimage, particularly on the anniversaries of the women's deaths. People would gather there, sometimes in organized ceremonies, sometimes as individuals seeking a moment of reflection. They would leave flowers, light candles, stand in silence beside the water that had once hidden such terrible secrets. The lake, which had been synonymous with horror for so long, gradually transformed into a site of remembrance and mourning. But the practical implications of the case extended far beyond symbolic gestures. The Bruma Lake murders exposed critical vulnerabilities in how South Africa's informal transportation system operated, or failed to operate, with regard to passenger safety. The fact that Simon Majola could work as an unlicensed taxi driver, operating with minimal oversight and no background checks, highlighted systemic failures that put vulnerable populations at risk. In response, advocacy groups pushed for reforms. They demanded better regulation of minibus taxi operators, including mandatory background checks and regular safety inspections. They called for increased police patrols in areas where women frequently waited for transportation, particularly during evening hours. They organized community watch programs and self-defense workshops. Some of these initiatives gained traction. Others foundered against bureaucratic inertia and resource limitations. Change came slowly, incompletely, but it came. The trial also sparked broader conversations about violence against women in South Africa, a country with one of the world's highest rates of femicide and gender-based violence. Activist organizations used the Bruma Lake case as a rallying point, arguing that the murders of Thandai, Namsa, Precious, Lindai, and Mfo were extreme manifestations of a culture that systematically devalued women's lives and safety. They connected these individual tragedies to larger patterns of abuse, assault, and murder that claimed thousands of women's lives annually. These conversations were uncomfortable, forcing confrontations with difficult truths about power, gender, and violence. They didn't produce immediate solutions. Problems this deeply embedded in social structures rarely yield to quick fixes. But they changed the discourse, made it harder to dismiss women's safety concerns as overreactions or hysteria, created space for more serious engagement with prevention and accountability. For Detective Kumalo, the case became both the pinnacle and the burden of his career. He received commendations for his work, was promoted, became a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences where he discussed serial offender investigations. But he also carried the weight of those 5 women, of the time it took to identify and capture Majola, of the question that haunted him in quiet moments. Could they have caught him sooner? Could any of the later victims have been saved if they'd made different investigative choices earlier? He knew intellectually that such thinking was unproductive. Investigations unfolded according to the evidence available, the resources at hand, the inevitable limitations of working in real time rather than with the clarity of hindsight. But knowing this didn't entirely dispel the guilt. It never did for investigators who worked these cases. The successful ones carried their victims with them always. Simon Majola himself largely vanished from public consciousness after his imprisonment. He was transferred to a maximum security facility, where he existed in the strange limbo of long-term incarceration. Prison officials noted that he was a model prisoner in the sense that he didn't cause disturbances or disciplinary problems. He followed rules, kept to himself, participated minimally in available programs. But he also showed no signs of genuine rehabilitation or remorse. In the few interviews he granted to researchers studying serial offenders, he remained emotionally flat, describing his crimes with the same clinical detachment he'd displayed during his confession. One psychologist who interviewed him years into his sentence noted that Majola seemed to view his life as essentially over, not because of remorse or despair, but because he no longer had access to the activity that had given his existence meaning. Without the ability to hunt, to kill, to exercise the power of life and death over others, he was simply marking time until his biological death. It was a chilling observation that underscored how fundamentally different his psychology was from normative human experience. There was speculation, never fully resolved, about whether Majola had additional victims beyond the 5 confirmed murders. His cryptic comments during interrogation about others, and before I perfected the method, suggested possible earlier crimes. Police investigated unsolved disappearances of women in the eastern Johannesburg area going back several years before 2008, looking for patterns that might connect to Majola. They found several cases that were suspicious, women who vanished without trace, whose circumstances bore some similarities to the known victims, but nothing definitive enough to charge him with additional murders. The truth, whatever it might be, remained locked inside Majola's head, and he showed no inclination to provide clarity. Perhaps he derived some final measure of power from withholding that information, from knowing that families of other missing women might wonder forever whether their loved ones had encountered him. Or perhaps there were no other victims, and his hints were simply another form of manipulation, an attempt to seem more significant than he actually was. Bruma Lake itself gradually returned to something approaching normalcy. The intense police presence faded. Joggers and walkers reclaimed the paths around the water. Families returned to picnicking on the grass during summer weekends. But the lake would never be quite the same. Its history had been permanently altered. People who used the space did so with awareness of what had happened there, of the women whose bodies had floated in those waters. The past couldn't be erased, could only be acknowledged and carried forward. The Bruma Lake murders stand as a stark reminder of certain terrible truths about human nature and society. They remind us that evil is not always dramatic or obvious. Simon Majola wasn't a Hollywood monster with visible signs of his pathology. He was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd. And that ordinariness was precisely what made him dangerous. It allowed him to move through society without triggering alarm, to approach victims without immediately signaling threat, to hide in plain sight while accumulating a body count. The case also highlights the particular vulnerabilities faced by women, especially women who lack economic resources and rely on informal systems for basic needs like transportation. Every woman who climbed into Simon Majola's vehicle was making a calculation familiar to millions of women worldwide, weighing the need to get somewhere against the risk of accepting help from a stranger. Most of the time, that calculation works out fine. The stranger is just a stranger, the ride is just a ride, and life continues. But occasionally, devastatingly, the calculation fails and the consequence is death. This doesn't mean the victims made mistakes. They didn't. The mistake belonged entirely to Simon Majola, who chose to exploit the trust and vulnerability of others for his own sick purposes. The mistake belonged to a society that creates conditions where women must make such calculations in the first place, where basic safety cannot be taken for granted, where predators can operate with relative ease if they're patient and careful. The investigation that eventually brought Majola to justice demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of modern law enforcement. On one hand, the task force's eventual success showed how methodical evidence collection, analysis of patterns, and patient investigative work can solve even complex serial cases. On the other hand, the months-long hunt revealed how difficult it is to identify and capture a careful predator before they claim multiple victims, especially when that predator targets vulnerable populations whose disappearances don't always trigger immediate large-scale responses. For the families of Thandai Umlongo, Namsa Dlamini, Precious Ndlovu, Lindayo Radebe, and Mfo Sithole. The conviction of Simon Majola provided a form of resolution, but not healing. Healing from such trauma isn't really possible. The wounds are too deep, the loss is too profound. Instead, families learn to live with the absence, to construct new versions of their lives around the permanent hole left by the murdered person. They mark birthdays that will never be celebrated, imagine milestones that will never be reached, and carry forward the memory of women who should still be alive. The memorial at Bruma Lake serves as a physical anchor for that memory, a place where the public can engage with what happened and commit to preventing similar tragedies. But the real memorial is the ongoing work, the advocacy for women's safety, the push for better systems and protections, the refusal to accept violence against women as inevitable or normal. The women who died at Simon Majola's hands cannot be brought back. But their deaths can mean something if they catalyze change, if they contribute to a world where fewer women have to make dangerous calculations about whether to trust a stranger offering a ride home. As darkness settles over Johannesburg each evening, women still wait at taxi ranks and bus stops, still make their way through the city's sprawling geography, still navigate the complex risk calculations that attend being female in spaces that aren't always safe. The arrest and conviction of Simon Majola made the world marginally safer by removing one predator from circulation. But he was one predator among many, one manifestation of a larger problem that persists. The story of the Bruma Lake killer isn't just about Simon Majola. It's about the women he murdered and the lives they should have lived. It's about the families who survived them and continue surviving them every day. It's about a community forced to confront the monster in its midst and the difficult work of ensuring such monsters have fewer opportunities to hunt. And it's about the lake itself, that body of water that witnessed such horror, that held such terrible secrets in its depths, that now serves as both a grave marker and a memorial. The water continues its quiet work, reflecting the sky, supporting life, existing in its own natural rhythms. But for those who know its history, who remember what happened there, Bruma Lake will always carry the weight of those 5 names, those 5 women who deserved so much more than they received, who deserved to grow old and see their dreams realized and live the ordinary beautiful lives that Simon Majola stole from them. Their names are carved in stone now, standing beside the water that once concealed them. Thandayo, Namsa, Precious, Lindayo, Fo. They are not forgotten. They will never be forgotten. And in that remembering lies both the grief of what was lost and the determination to ensure their deaths were not meaningless. The monster has been caged. The hunt is over. But the echoes of those terrible months continue to reverberate, a reminder that evil walks among us, that vigilance is never optional, and that every life, every single life, matters immeasurably. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Golden State Killer, When Evil Wore a Badge. A masked predator slithered through suburban windows for over a decade, leaving California drowning in terror. He raped 50 women. He murdered 13 people. He shattered the lives of hundreds more. And when detectives finally cornered him 40 years later, they discovered something that made the blood freeze in their veins. He'd been a police officer the entire time. Tonight, you'll learn how one man became America's most prolific serial predator, how he vanished like smoke for 4 decades, and how a genealogy website finally dragged him into the light. This is the story of Joseph James D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, a monster who understood exactly how to hunt his prey because he'd sworn an oath to protect them. The moon hung low over Visalia, California, that September night in 1974, casting skeletal shadows across the manicured lawns of middle-class suburbia. Behind drawn curtains, families settled into their evening routines, unaware that something ancient and hungry had just arrived in their neighborhood. It started with small violations. Trinkets disappearing from bedroom dressers. Underwear vanished from laundry lines. Piggy banks emptied. Their ceramic shells left intact but hollow. The residents of this agricultural town initially dismissed these incidents as teenage mischief, the kind of pranks that fade with time and stricter parenting. They were catastrophically wrong. Between April 1974 and December 1975, over 100 homes were invaded by a phantom who moved through the darkness like vapor. He didn't just steal, he desecrated. He rifled through family photographs with gloved fingers, rearranged personal items to prove he'd been there, left faucets running to waste water. He stood over sleeping children, listening to their breath, studying their vulnerable forms. Sometimes he'd return to the same house multiple times, each visit a psychological violation more profound than the last. The police dubbed him the Visalia ransacker, but that clinical term failed to capture the theatrical cruelty of his crimes. This wasn't about poverty or desperation. This was about power, the intoxicating thrill of dominating strangers in their most sacred spaces. He would spend hours inside homes, eating food from refrigerators, trying on clothing, masturbating into drawers full of women's undergarments. He transformed each residence into his personal stage, performing rituals that only he understood. Victims woke to find doors unlocked that they'd secured, windows ajar that they'd latched tight. One woman discovered muddy boot prints leading directly to her teenage daughter's bedside, circling the mattress like a wolf had paced there, deciding whether to feast. Another family found their living room furniture rearranged into a bizarre pattern. Chairs facing walls, the couch turned toward the fireplace, as though some invisible audience had gathered for a show that never happened. The ransacker possessed an almost supernatural ability to evade capture. He struck during the narrowest windows of opportunity, when husbands worked late shifts, when families attended church on Wednesday evenings, when parents stepped out for 30-minute grocery runs. He demonstrated intimate knowledge of his victims' schedules, suggesting surveillance so meticulous it bordered on obsessive. Some investigators theorized he stalked his targets for weeks before entering their homes, learning their patterns the way a scientist studies laboratory rats. His physical description came in fragments, each witness offering contradictory details that rendered him simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Medium height or maybe tall, athletic build or possibly stocky, dark hair unless it was brown or perhaps dirty blonde. The only consistent detail was his mask, a homemade creation fashioned from nylon or cloth that transformed his features into a featureless void. Those who glimpsed him described a presence more than a person, a wrongness that polluted rooms and lingered after he'd fled. The attacks escalated with mathematical precision. What began as burglary metastasized into sexual sadism. The ransacker started entering occupied homes, standing in doorways while families slept, inches from where children dreamed. He'd remove objects and leave them in conspicuous locations. A jewelry box placed on a kitchen counter, car keys dangled from a bedroom lamp, telegraphing his dominion over every inch of these private worlds. Then came the phone calls. Victims would answer to hear breathing slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Sometimes he'd whisper fragments of sentences that dissolved into giggles, a childlike sound that made their skin crawl. He described what they'd worn that day, what they'd eaten for dinner, which drawer contained their most intimate possessions. He was proving a thesis written in terror. You are never safe, not even when your doors are locked and your lights are on. Detective William McGowan led the Visalia Police Department's investigation, poring over crime scene photographs that revealed a pattern others missed. The ransacker always removed exterior light bulbs before entering, plunging backyard approaches into absolute darkness. He frequently disabled phone lines, cutting the connection between victims and help. He left pry marks at multiple entry points, suggesting he'd tested several access routes before choosing the optimal one. This wasn't amateur chaos, this was tradecraft. McGowan assembled a profile. Male, probably between 20 and 30 years old, physically fit, possessing above-average intelligence and organizational skills. Someone familiar with police procedures and investigative techniques. Someone who lived or worked in Visalia, allowing him to monitor his territory without attracting suspicion. someone experiencing a psychological escalation that wouldn't plateau until he'd crossed the ultimate boundary. That boundary shattered on December 10, 1975. Claude Snelling, a journalism professor at the College of the Sequoias, woke to sounds of struggle emanating from his daughter's bedroom. Elizabeth, 16 years old, had been asleep when a masked figure materialized beside her bed, pressing a knife against her throat and hissing instructions. "Don't scream. Don't fight. Come with me." Claude burst into the hallway just as the intruder dragged Elizabeth toward the back door. What happened next unfolded in the compressed time of nightmares. Claude lunged forward, grabbing his daughter and wrenching her from the stranger's grip. Elizabeth broke free and ran. The masked man raised a gun, where had he concealed a gun, and fired twice. Claude Snelling collapsed, blood blooming across his chest in dark flowers. The killer fled into the night, vanishing into the labyrinth of surrounding streets before police could establish a perimeter. Claude died before the ambulance arrived, his final words a question about whether Elizabeth was safe. She was physically unharmed, but the psychological wounds would never fully heal. She'd been the ransacker's chosen prey, selected through criteria no one could fully comprehend, and only her father's sacrifice had prevented her abduction. The murder transformed the investigation from property crimes to homicide. The ransacker's reign of terror had produced its first corpse, and the community understood with chilling certainty that more would follow unless he was stopped. Police staked out neighborhoods, installed alarm systems in vulnerable homes, educated residents about security protocols. But the ransacker had already evolved beyond their countermeasures. 1 month after Claude Snelling's murder, Officer McGowan spotted a suspicious figure prowling near a residence that matched the ransacker's victim profile. McGowan pursued on foot, chasing the suspect through backyards and across streets. The figure demonstrated remarkable agility, vaulting fences and navigating obstacles with practiced ease. Then, abruptly, he vanished, simply dissolved into the darkness as though reality had absorbed him. McGowan searched for hours, eventually discovering a discarded mask near a storm drain. Laboratory analysis revealed nothing useful. No DNA technology existed yet, no databases to cross-reference fiber evidence. The mask was cheap cotton, purchasable at any drugstore in America. The ransacker had left them another taunt, another reminder of his invincibility. After December 1975, the Visalia attacks ceased. The ransacker had evaporated, leaving behind traumatized families and unanswered questions. Most detectives assumed he'd been scared off by the homicide investigation's intensity, or perhaps arrested for unrelated crimes in another jurisdiction. Some speculated he'd moved away, or died, or simply lost interest in his twisted hobby. They were wrong on all counts. The ransacker hadn't stopped. He'd merely relocated and refined his methodology. 40 miles north, in Sacramento County, a new nightmare was preparing to unfold. The predator had tested his skills in Visalia's suburban laboratory, and now he was ready to inflict his fully realized horror upon an unsuspecting population. The escalation that Detective McGowan had predicted was about to manifest in ways too monstrous to imagine. The Visalia ransacker chapter should have been a warning, a clear signal that something profoundly wrong was loose in California. Instead, it became prologue to a decade of terror that would haunt an entire state. The skills he'd honed breaking into homes, evading police, and terrorizing families would serve him well in the campaigns to come. He'd learned patience, discipline, and the intoxicating truth that ordinary people are remarkably easy to dominate once you breach their fragile sense of security. Joseph James D'Angelo, though no one knew his name yet, was just getting started. The monster had been born in Visalia, but it would reach full maturity stalking the neighborhoods of Sacramento, Contra Costa County, and eventually, Southern California. Each phase of his evolution would demonstrate new depravities, new refinements of cruelty, new proof that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives wearing a mask, testing windows, learning schedules, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The families who'd been violated by the ransacker would spend decades wondering who he was, why he'd chosen them, whether he still thought about the fear he'd planted in their hearts. Those questions would haunt them until 2018, when DNA evidence finally attached a name and face to the phantom who'd poisoned their lives. But that revelation lay decades in the future. For now, the ransacker had vanished, leaving only shadows and the terrible certainty that monsters don't simply disappear. They just move on to richer hunting grounds. Sacramento in 1976 hummed with post-Vietnam optimism and suburban expansion. Ranch-style homes sprouted across former farmland, their picture windows and open floor plans embodying California's promise of sun-soaked prosperity. Young couples invested their futures in these neighborhoods, believing that locked doors and neighborhood watch programs would keep danger at bay. They were building lives on sand. The first attack came on June 18, 1976. A single woman, living alone in Rancho Cordova, woke to find a figure looming over her bed. He wore a ski mask that obliterated his features, reducing his face to something subhuman. Before she could scream, he pressed a knife against her throat, the blade so close she could feel its temperature, and spoke in a rehearsed whisper, "Shut up or I'll kill you. Do exactly what I say or I'll kill you." What followed established a pattern that would repeat 50 times over the next 5 years. He bound her wrists and ankles with shoelaces he'd brought, his knots tied with professional precision. He blindfolded her with torn strips of towel, plunging her into darkness that made every sound amplified and terrible. He placed dishes on her back and warned that if she heard them rattle, he'd return to the bedroom and kill her. Then, for the next 2 hours, he ransacked her home, ate from her refrigerator, and periodically returned to assault her again. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical violence. He spoke to her throughout the ordeal, sometimes in that forced whisper, sometimes in a bizarre, childlike voice that suggested multiple personalities warring for control. He told her he needed money for a sick mother, a lie so transparent it seemed designed to mock her powerlessness. He cried at one point, shuddering sobs that made her wonder if she was supposed to comfort him. Then he'd laugh, high and cruel, revealing the tears as performance. Before leaving, he stood in the doorway and delivered a promise. "I'll kill you if you tell. I know where you live. I know where you work. I'll come back and slit your throat while you sleep." Then he vanished into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind a woman whose sense of safety had been incinerated. The Sacramento County Sheriff's Department initially treated the case as an isolated incident, horrifying but singular. Then 3 weeks later, another woman reported an identical attack. Then another, and another. By October 1976, the pattern had become undeniable. A serial rapist was systematically targeting women throughout Sacramento's eastern suburbs, and he was demonstrating skills that suggested professional training. Detective Richard Shelby assembled a task force to study the emerging profile. The rapist, soon dubbed the East Area Rapist or AR, never struck randomly. He stalked his victims for weeks, learning their routines, determining when they'd be most vulnerable. Single women living alone were primary targets, but he also attacked couples, forcing husbands to lie face down while he bound them, stacking dishes on their backs before leading wives to other rooms for hours of assault. The psychological devastation was intentional. He wanted men to feel emasculated, helpless, destroyed by their inability to protect those they loved. His reconnaissance was extraordinary. Victims reported finding pry marks on windows days before attacks, suggesting he'd tested entry points during dry runs. Phone calls preceded many assaults, hang-ups or breathing that served as final surveillance, confirming the target was home and alone. He demonstrated knowledge of layouts he shouldn't possess, navigating unfamiliar homes in complete darkness without stumbling or hesitation. Some investigators theorized he entered homes during the day, when residents were at work, memorizing floor plans and unlocking windows for later access. AR brought prepackaged ligatures, shoelaces, thin rope, strips of towel, indicating premeditation. He wore gloves that left no fingerprints. He removed light bulbs from exterior fixtures, cloaking his approach in darkness. He sometimes disabled phone lines before entering, severing victims' connection to emergency services. Every detail betrayed familiarity with police procedure and criminal investigation techniques. His physical description remained frustratingly vague. Victims reported heights ranging from 5'9" to 6'2", suggesting he altered his posture or wore lifts. His weight fluctuated between reports, lean and athletic in some accounts, stockier in others. His voice was his only consistent identifier. High-pitched, sometimes whispering, sometimes mimicking a child, occasionally erupting into a guttural snarl when victims struggled or failed to comply immediately. The mask became his signature. Sometimes a ski mask, sometimes a homemade cloth covering, occasionally a nylon stocking that distorted his features into something grotesque. One victim who briefly glimpsed him described, "Dead eyes, shark eyes, eyes that look through you rather than at you." Another reported that he seemed to be trembling constantly, vibrating with barely controlled rage or excitement or some emotion she couldn't identify. The attacks escalated in frequency and depravity. He began calling victims days after assaults, heavy breathing punctuated by whispered threats. "Remember when we had fun?" He'd describe details from the attack, proving it was him, reinforcing his message that escape was impossible. He'd call victims' husbands at work, taunting them about their failure to protect their wives. Some families received calls for months, the ear's voice invading their attempts to rebuild normalcy. He started attacking multiple times per week, sometimes targeting homes mere blocks apart on the same night. The pace suggested someone with unlimited free time, or someone whose employment gave them flexibility and night shift availability. Detectives theorized he might be a security guard, a night worker, perhaps even a police officer who could patrol neighborhoods without attracting suspicion. That final theory gained traction when investigators documented incidents of the EAR apparently monitoring police response in real time. He'd strike houses adjacent to ongoing investigations, as though mocking the task force's inability to catch him. He left taunting evidence, a stolen homework assignment with homework crossed out and punishment written above it, suggesting this was his mission, his vocation. At one crime scene, he left a map with certain houses circled, implying a hit list of future victims. The psychological warfare was as relentless as the physical attacks. Community panic metastasized into hysteria. Gun sales spiked 300% in Sacramento County. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, window locks, and alarm systems. Neighborhoods organized armed patrols. Men with hunting rifles walking streets in shifts, looking for anyone suspicious. The EAR adapted, apparently finding these amateur security measures amusing. He struck homes where neighbors were conducting watch patrols, slipping past civilian guards with contemptuous ease. In October 1977, he attacked a couple in South Sacramento, binding the husband with such elaborate knots that detectives recognized them as nautical or military grade. Before leaving, he stood over the husband and spoke in a voice thick with rage. "I'll kill you. I'll kill you. I'll kill you." He repeated the phrase for over a minute, his voice escalating from whisper to shout, terrifying the victim more profoundly than the physical assault. The husband later told detectives he'd been certain he was about to die, that the phrase wasn't a threat, but a promise the AR intended to fulfill. That prediction came true on February 2nd, 1978. Brian and Katie Majori were walking their dog through a Rancho Cordova neighborhood when they encountered a masked figure lurking between houses. Brian confronted him, likely demanding to know what he was doing, why he was trespassing. The figure produced a gun and fired twice. Brian collapsed, a bullet through his chest. Katie ran, but the gunman pursued her, executing her in a nearby yard with a bullet to the head. Then he vanished, leaving the couple's dog standing guard over their bodies, barking at shadows. The double homicide transformed the EAR investigation into California's highest priority case. The FBI joined local authorities, bringing resources and expertise. Psychiatrists developed profiles suggesting a white male, aged 25 to 35, possibly military or law enforcement background, experiencing a psychosexual disorder that required escalating violence to achieve satisfaction. They warned that he wouldn't stop until caught or killed, that his trajectory was toward more frequent and lethal attacks. The Majori murders temporarily halted the assaults. For 3 months, Sacramento endured silence, residents wondering if the killer had been scared off or perhaps arrested for unrelated crimes. Then, on May 4th, 1978, he struck again, same methodology, same calculated cruelty, proving the pause had been strategic rather than fear-driven. He'd simply waited for police attention to wane before resuming his campaign. Between May and July 1978, the ER attacked 11 more times, his pace accelerating to a fever pitch. He seemed to be hurrying now, compressed by some internal timeline only he understood. The assaults grew more violent, the bindings tighter, the psychological torture more elaborate. He forced one victim to bind her husband using techniques he dictated step by step, making her complicit in her own victimization. He told another woman he'd kidnapped her daughter. A lie, but one that devastated her until police confirmed the child was safe at a sleepover. Then, abruptly, the East Area attacks ceased. July 1978 marked his final Sacramento assault. Detectives assumed he'd finally been identified and fled, or perhaps died, or been incarcerated for unrelated offenses. The task force continued investigating, but without new incidents, momentum flagged. Victims tried rebuilding their shattered lives, though most would struggle with PTSD for decades. Sacramento began the long process of healing, but the East Area rapist hadn't stopped. He'd simply relocated. Southern California was about to learn that the nightmare that had terrorized Sacramento was now hunting new territories. And the monster wasn't finished escalating. His next phase would trade rape for murder, transforming him from serial sex offender into one of America's most prolific serial killers. The victims he'd left behind in Sacramento would spend 40 years wondering why they'd been chosen, whether he still thought about them, whether they'd contributed to his capture by providing evidence that eventually mattered. Those questions wouldn't be answered until 2018, when genetic genealogy finally revealed the Phantom's identity. But that revelation lay decades in the future, separated from these crimes by an impossible gulf of time and anguish. For now, the East Area rapist was a ghost. 50 attacks, 2 murders, hundreds of traumatized victims, and not a single viable suspect. He demonstrated that California's suburban paradise was just an illusion, that locks and alarms and neighborhood watches couldn't stop someone determined to inflict suffering. He'd proven that evil doesn't need supernatural powers to dominate innocent people. Just planning, patience, and an absolute absence of conscience. Joseph James D'Angelo was entering the apex of his predatory career, and the worst was yet to come. The coordinates shifted southward in October 1979, when a young couple in Goleta, a beachside community near Santa Barbara, heard glass shatter in their kitchen. Robert Offerman, an orthopedic surgeon, and Deborah Manning, a clinical psychologist, had been asleep when the noise jolted them awake. Robert grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the disturbance. He never returned to the bedroom. The gunshots were execution style. Robert shot twice in the back of the head, falling forward into the kitchen. The killer then methodically hunted Deborah through the house, cornering her in the bedroom and firing 3 rounds into her skull. Both victims were nude, suggesting the intruder had interrupted an intimate moment, transforming their vulnerability into his opportunity. He ransacked the home afterward, stealing jewelry and identification, leaving behind ligatures and dishes that matched the East Area rapist's signature methodology. Law enforcement in Southern California initially didn't connect this double homicide to Sacramento's sexual predator. The crimes seemed fundamentally different: murder rather than rape, a 300-mile geographical leap, a 16-month gap between the last ER attack and this killing. The pattern that linked them remained invisible to investigators drowning in data but lacking the technology to synthesize connections across jurisdictions. 3 months later, on December 30th, 1979, the killer struck Goleta again. Lyman and Charlene Smith, a patent attorney and interior decorator, were bludgeoned to death in their home with a fireplace log. The brutality was extraordinary. Skulls fractured, faces destroyed, blood spatter painting walls in abstract horror. The killer had bound Lyman before beating him, forcing Charlene to watch her husband's murder before turning the log on her. He raped Charlene post-mortem, a final desecration of her destroyed body. The Southern California attacks established a new pattern. The killer targeted affluent couples in upscale neighborhoods, entering through unlocked doors or pried windows in the dead hours before dawn. He brought his own ligatures and weapons, though he'd improvise with household items when opportunity presented. Fireplace logs, kitchen knives, whatever implements of destruction his environment offered. The violence was overwhelming, suggesting rage far beyond what was necessary to subdue or kill. Media coverage exploded. The press dubbed him various names: the Night Stalker, the original Night Stalker, to distinguish him from Richard Ramirez, who later claimed the Night Stalker title, the Diamond Knot Killer, referencing his elaborate binding techniques. Each jurisdiction investigated independently, unaware they were hunting the same predator who'd terrorized Sacramento years earlier. The bureaucratic fragmentation allowed him to continue undetected, slipping between the cracks of competing investigations. On March 13, 1980, he invaded the Ventura County home of Charlene and Lyman Smith's neighbors, Keith and Patrice Harrington, newlyweds who'd been married less than 3 months. The killer bludgeoned Keith with a blunt object, fracturing his skull in multiple locations. He beat Patrice to death, her injuries so severe the coroner struggled to identify her features. Both had been bound before the attacks, immobilized and helpless, forced to experience their final moments in absolute terror. The murders were becoming more frequent, more violent, more personal. He wasn't just killing, he was annihilating, destroying families and futures with methodical precision. Detectives noted that he targeted couples rather than individuals, suggesting his psychology involved not just murder but the destruction of relationships, the elimination of happiness he perhaps couldn't experience himself. Then came an 11-month pause. Between March 1980 and February 1981, Southern California experienced silence, the killer apparently dormant or dead or imprisoned. Communities began cautiously exhaling, wondering if the nightmare had concluded. Gun sales declined slightly. Residential alarm installations plateaued. People tentatively resumed normal lives. On February 6, 1981, the killer shattered that fragile peace by murdering Manuela Withun, a 28-year-old nurse in Irvine. Her husband was away, hospitalized for a serious illness, leaving Manuela alone and vulnerable. The intruder bound her, raped her, then bludgeoned her to death with a crystal candlestick he found in the home. The weapon choice was almost theatrical, transforming a decorative object into an instrument of execution, contaminating the residence with symbolism its owner would never escape. The pause between Patrice Harrington and Manuela Withun, nearly a year, suggested the killer might have been incarcerated for unrelated offenses, or perhaps deployed if he had military connections, or simply experiencing a cooling-off period while he refined his methodology. The gaps in his timeline would haunt investigators for decades, raising questions about whether additional victims existed in jurisdictions that never connected their cases to the larger pattern. His final confirmed murder occurred on May 4, 1986, a date that would resonate decades later when investigators realized it marked exactly 8 years after one of his last Sacramento attacks. Janelle Cruz, an 18-year-old high school student, was home alone when the killer entered her Irvine residence. He raped her, then beat her to death with a pipe wrench, leaving her body for her family to discover. The brutality was extraordinary even by his standards. Over 50 wounds, her skull fractured in multiple locations, the weapon applied with such force it bent from the impacts. Janelle Cruz's murder marked the apparent conclusion of the original Night Stalker's reign of terror. After May 1986, the Southern California attacks ceased. Detectives theorized he died, been imprisoned, or simply stopped. The cooling-off periods between his attacks had been growing longer, 11 months, then 5 years, suggesting his compulsion might be waning or his circumstances changing. Some profilers speculated he'd moved overseas, perhaps military deployment, or relocated to jurisdictions where his crimes remained unconnected to the larger pattern. The victims he'd left behind, 13 confirmed murders, 50 rapes, over 100 burglaries, represented just the documented cases. Investigators suspected the actual numbers were higher, that crimes in rural areas or smaller jurisdictions had been attributed to local offenders rather than the systematic predator stalking California. The true scope of his destruction might never be fully known. What frustrated detectives most was the absolute absence of usable physical evidence. This was the pre-DNA era, when forensic science relied on fingerprints, blood typing, and witness testimony. The killer wore gloves that eliminated prints. His blood type, a positive, was shared by 34% of the population, rendering it investigatively useless. Witnesses provided contradictory descriptions that suggested either he was altering his appearance or victims' trauma distorted their perceptions. The psychological profile that emerged was chilling in its implications. He was organized, patient, methodical, characteristics suggesting high intelligence and possibly professional training. He demonstrated knowledge of police procedure that indicated either law enforcement background or meticulous study of investigative techniques. His ability to evade capture despite hundreds of officers hunting him suggested either extraordinary luck or inside information about task force activities. His victim selection revealed dark patterns. He targeted specific demographic slices: young couples building lives together, women living alone, families that embodied suburban success. Some investigators theorized he was destroying the normalcy he couldn't achieve himself, that his attacks were revenge against people whose happiness highlighted his own dysfunction. Others suggested he was collecting psychological trophies, the stolen jewelry and identification serving as mementos of his dominance over victims' lives. The phone calls continued even after the murders stopped. Victims from Sacramento received whispered threats years after their assaults, the killer reminding them he still remembered, still possessed power over their peace of mind. One woman reported a call in 1991, 15 years after her attack, where the familiar voice asked if she'd thought about him. The psychological torture extended decades beyond the physical crimes, poisoning lives with the certainty that he was still out there, still watching, still capable of returning. California law enforcement established a database attempting to connect the various crime series: the Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. But without DNA technology or computerized record-keeping, the links remained theoretical rather than proven. Different agencies pursued different suspects, some convinced the crimes were committed by multiple offenders rather than a single predator. The fragmentation prevented unified investigation, allowing the truth to remain hidden in plain sight. In 2001, breakthrough DNA technology finally linked the East Area rapist to the original Night Stalker, confirming what some detectives had long suspected. These were phases of a single predator's evolution, not separate offenders. The revelation came 15 years after the last confirmed murder, when the killer had presumably retired or died, rendering the discovery academically interesting but investigatively useless. Or so it seemed. The victims who'd survived couldn't move forward and couldn't forget. They lived with hypervigilance that exhausted them, jumping at shadows, checking locks obsessively, sleeping with weapons accessible. Marriages dissolved under the strain, husbands tormented by their inability to protect wives, wives unable to be intimate without flashbacks to their assaults. Children grew up in homes saturated with unspoken trauma, inheriting anxiety they couldn't fully comprehend. Communities changed in fundamental ways. Sacramento's suburbs never fully recovered their pre-AR innocence. Southern California's beach towns acknowledged that paradise had been contaminated by evil that might never be punished. The killer had accomplished something perhaps more profound than his physical crimes. He taught an entire state that safety was illusion, that suburban comfort could be breached by anyone sufficiently committed to inflicting harm. But evil, no matter how careful, eventually makes mistakes. And advances in forensic science were preparing to resurrect cold cases that had been considered unsolvable. DNA technology was evolving beyond simple matching toward genealogical analysis that could identify criminals through their relatives' genetic profiles. The investigation was about to enter its final phase, and the killer who'd evaded justice for 4 decades was about to discover that time doesn't erase evidence. It just delays reckoning. The Golden State Killer wasn't finished with California. California was just getting started with him. Time became the predator's ally. The 1990s dissolved into the 2000s. Cases growing colder, detectives retiring, witnesses dying, evidence degrading in storage lockers forgotten by bureaucracies focused on fresh crimes. The Golden State Killer, the umbrella term eventually applied to link all his crime series, became legend rather than active investigation. True crime enthusiasts debated his identity on internet forums, generating theories that ranged from plausible to absurd. He was dead. He was imprisoned. He'd moved to Europe. He'd achieved a legitimate career that satisfied his psychological needs. Every theory shared one assumption: he'd never be caught. That assumption was shattered by three developments that converged in the 2010s to create an investigative revolution. First, DNA technology matured beyond simple matching. Genetic genealogy emerged as a forensic tool, allowing investigators to use crime scene DNA to build family trees, identifying suspects through distant relatives who'd uploaded their genetic profiles to ancestry websites. The technique was controversial. Critics argued it violated privacy rights, that people submitting DNA to learn about their heritage didn't consent to having that information weaponized for law enforcement. But for cold case investigators drowning in unsolved files, it represented the first real breakthrough in decades. Second, the internet facilitated unprecedented collaboration. The /r/Iran subreddit became a hub where amateur sleuths and retired detectives shared theories, crime scene photos, and investigative timelines. Michelle McNamara, a true crime writer, began researching the case obsessively, convinced modern technology could finally identify the killer. Her unfinished book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, became a posthumous bestseller when published in 2018, renewing public interest and putting pressure on law enforcement to prioritize the case. Third, institutional barriers between jurisdictions began crumbling. Different agencies, Visalia PD, Sacramento County Sheriff, FBI, Orange County DA, finally started sharing information comprehensively, acknowledging that the crimes were connected and required coordinated investigation. A new task force formed, pooled resources, and committed to applying cutting-edge forensic techniques to the decades-old evidence. The breakthrough came from genealogy. Investigators extracted DNA from crime scenes and uploaded the profile to GEDmatch, a public ancestry database where users voluntarily share genetic information. The DNA didn't match any criminal database. The killer had never been arrested for an offense requiring DNA submission. But it matched distant relatives, third and fourth cousins who'd submitted their profiles hoping to learn about their heritage. From those distant matches, a forensic genealogist named Barbara Raventer began constructing family trees. She worked backward through generations, identifying common ancestors shared by the genetic matches. Then she worked forward, tracing descendants until she reached individuals of appropriate age, location, and demographics to be the killer. The process took months, each branch of the family tree requiring verification through historical records, obituaries, birth certificates, census data. The name that eventually emerged from this genealogical excavation was Joseph James DeAngelo, a name that meant nothing to the general public but sent shockwaves through the investigative community. DeAngelo, born November 8, 1945, had been a police officer during the East Area Rapists Sacramento campaign. He'd worked for Auburn PD from 1976 to 1979, patrolling the very neighborhoods where the AR had struck repeatedly. The revelation was simultaneously vindicating and horrifying. Detectives had been correct that the killer possessed law enforcement knowledge, but the truth was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. He wasn't just familiar with police procedure, he was police. DeAngelo's biography read like a profile specifically designed to produce a serial predator. He'd served in the Navy during the Vietnam era, stationed at Naval Air Station at Tsuji in Japan, though his exact duties remained classified. After discharge, he attended Sierra College, studying criminal justice and police science. In 1973, he joined the Exeter Police Department in Tulare County, exactly where and when the Visalia ransacker attacks began. During his law enforcement career, DeAngelo was terminated from Auburn PD in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a hardware store. A bizarre, self-destructive act that cost him his badge. The theft occurred in August 1979, precisely when the East Area Rapist attacks were reaching their crescendo. Some investigators theorized the shoplifting was subconscious self-sabotage, that part of DeAngelo wanted to be caught, wanted the nightmare to end. Others believed it was pure arrogance. He'd evaded capture for years and assumed he was untouchable, even when stealing trivial items in broad daylight. After his termination, DeAngelo reinvented himself. He earned a criminal justice degree from California State University, Sacramento, and took a position as a mechanic at a Save Mart distribution center, steady employment that allowed him anonymity and flexibility. He married Sharon Huddle, an attorney, in 1973, before his predatory career began. They had 3 daughters together, living in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb he'd terrorized as the EAR. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. He'd eat breakfast with his family, attend his daughter's school events, perform routine household maintenance, all while harboring secrets that would have destroyed anyone who truly knew him. Neighbors described D'Angelo as volatile and strange. He'd scream obscenities at people who walked too close to his property. He'd engage in bizarre behaviors like roaring wordlessly at the night sky, a guttural sound that carried for blocks and disturbed everyone within earshot. He'd constructed an elaborate workshop in his garage, spending hours there engaged in projects no one could identify. Some neighbors avoided him entirely, instinctively recognizing something wrong even without evidence of his crimes. Yet he also maintained a veneer of normalcy. He attended family gatherings, celebrated holidays, took vacations. He was a grandfather, bouncing children on his knee, smiling for photographs that would later become evidence of how thoroughly evil can disguise itself. The duality was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychology. He could transition seamlessly between suburban grandfather and sadistic predator, suggesting either profound dissociation or a capacity for deception that transcended normal human psychology. On April 24, 2018, Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies converged on D'Angelo's Citrus Heights residence. He was 72 years old, decades removed from his crimes, living the retirement he denied 13 murder victims and traumatized countless others. The arrest was anticlimactic, no dramatic confrontation, no attempted escape. He was standing in his driveway, confused and elderly, when officers announced he was under arrest for murder. The initial shock gave way to calculation. D'Angelo invoked his right to silence, refusing to speak beyond confirming his identity. But his DNA, collected from his car door handle and a tissue discarded at a Hobby Lobby, would speak volumes his silence couldn't suppress. Laboratory analysis confirmed what genealogy had suggested. Joseph James D'Angelo's genetic profile matched DNA recovered from multiple crime scenes spanning 1976 to 1986. The arrest triggered an avalanche of media coverage. Survivors who'd spent 40 years wondering if they'd ever learn the truth suddenly had a face and name to attach to their nightmares. Some experienced relief. The monster was captured, caged, rendered powerless. Others felt rage so consuming it threatened to destroy them. 40 years stolen, families shattered, lives permanently damaged, and the person responsible had lived comfortably into old age, escaping consequences for decades. D'Angelo's family disintegrated. His wife filed for divorce. His daughters issued statements expressing devastation and disbelief. They'd lived with him for years, shared meals and vacations and ordinary moments, never suspecting the magnitude of his secrets. The betrayal they experienced was different from his victims' trauma, but no less profound. Their entire family history had been contaminated by revelations that transformed every memory into something sinister. As the investigation expanded, detectives discovered evidence D'Angelo had meticulously documented his crimes. Stolen jewelry and identification cards were recovered from his home, trophies he'd kept for decades. His garage contained items linked to specific attacks: earrings belonging to a Sacramento victim, a keychain stolen from a Southern California murder scene. He'd curated his collection like a museum exhibit, preserving mementos that allowed him to revisit his triumphs whenever the impulse struck. The legal proceedings were complicated by California's elimination of the death penalty for crimes committed before certain legislative changes. D'Angelo faced 13 murder charges, multiple rape charges, and additional counts for kidnapping and burglary. His attorneys initially indicated he'd plead not guilty, forcing victims to testify and relive their trauma in court. But prosecutors offered an alternative: plead guilty to all charges in exchange for multiple life sentences without parole, sparing victims the ordeal of trial. After months of negotiation, D'Angelo accepted the plea deal. On June 29, 2020, he appeared in Sacramento Superior Court to answer for crimes committed between 1975 and 1986. The proceeding was unlike anything the American legal system had witnessed. a sentencing hearing where dozens of survivors confronted their attacker, detailing how his actions had poisoned their lives. The victim impact statements were devastating. Women described decades of PTSD, marriages destroyed by trauma they couldn't overcome, children who grew up sensing their mother's terror without understanding its source. Widows spoke about husbands murdered 40 years earlier, relationships truncated at their beginning, futures stolen by a predator's selfish impulses. Siblings of murder victims described families fractured by grief, parents who died without seeing justice, questions that haunted them across decades. D'Angelo sat motionless throughout, showing no visible emotion. Some victims reported he appeared to be smirking, finding amusement in their pain even at this final reckoning. Others said he looked vacant, disconnected, as though dissociating from the litany of destruction his actions had caused. His demeanor suggested either profound psychopathy or cognitive decline, though most observers suspected the former disguised as the latter. Judge Michael Bowman sentenced D'Angelo to 11 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, plus 8 additional life terms and 15 years to life. The sentence was symbolic. D'Angelo would die in prison regardless of its specific structure. But its length mattered to victims, each term representing acknowledgement of specific suffering, specific lives destroyed, specific evil that demanded accounting. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Bowman addressed the courtroom. He spoke about evil's banality, how monsters don't always announce themselves with horns and fangs, but sometimes wear uniforms and blend into neighborhoods and live unremarkable lives punctuated by extraordinary cruelty. He acknowledged that justice, delayed for decades, felt hollow to many victims. But he emphasized that D'Angelo's capture proved that time doesn't erase accountability, that advances in science can resurrect cases once considered unsolvable, that evil eventually faces consequences even when those consequences arrive too late for complete healing. D'Angelo was transferred to California State Prison, Corcoran, where he'd spend his remaining years in protective custody, isolated from general population prisoners who reserve special hatred for sex offenders and child predators. He'd never walk freely again, never experience privacy or autonomy, never escape the cage his own actions constructed. For a predator who'd spent decades dominating others, the loss of control represented poetic justice. The investigative techniques that identified D'Angelo revolutionized cold case investigation. Genetic genealogy became standard practice, generating arrests in dozens of unsolved cases. The Golden State Killer's capture demonstrated that no crime, regardless of its age, was truly beyond resolution. Detectives who'd retired without seeing justice could now witness suspects arrested for crimes committed before DNA technology existed. The paradigm shift was profound. Predators who'd assumed time guaranteed safety suddenly faced the terrifying possibility that their past was pursuing them. But the resolution also raised uncomfortable questions about privacy, consent, and the boundaries of genetic surveillance. Should law enforcement access ancestry databases without warrants? Did distant relatives consent to having their DNA weaponized to identify criminals they'd never met? Where was the line between justice and overreach? These debates continue, balancing society's interest in solving crimes against individuals' rights to genetic privacy. For survivors, D'Angelo's capture brought complicated emotions rather than simple closure. Relief that he'd been caught competed with rage that he'd lived freely for 40 years, raising families and enjoying experiences he'd denied his victims. Some found peace in the resolution. Others felt the sentencing was inadequate, that no punishment could balance the scale of his destruction. A few expressed disappointment that he'd pleaded guilty rather than standing trial, denying them the catharsis of hearing a jury pronounce him guilty on all counts. Michelle McNamara, whose research helped maintain public pressure to solve the case, didn't live to see D'Angelo's arrest. She died in 2016, 2 years before the breakthrough. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, attended the sentencing hearing, acknowledging that his wife's obsessive investigation had contributed to the renewed focus that ultimately identified the killer. Her book's title, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, quoted the ear's threat to a victim. D'Angelo's capture transformed that threat into hollow boasting. He wasn't gone, and the darkness couldn't hide him forever. The case revealed how thoroughly evil can infiltrate ordinary life. D'Angelo wasn't a Hollywood monster. He was a neighbor, a coworker, a grandfather. He shopped at grocery stores, attended community events, lived in suburbs he'd once terrorized. The cognitive dissonance challenged fundamental assumptions about how to identify dangerous people. If someone like D'Angelo could hide in plain sight for decades, who else might be concealing monstrous secrets behind ordinary facades? Detectives who devoted careers to catching the Golden State Killer experienced bittersweet vindication. They'd been correct about many profile elements: law enforcement background, high intelligence, meticulous planning. But the decades required to prove those theories meant many officers retired or died without seeing resolution. The investigation consumed lives, destroyed marriages, created obsessions that outlasted careers. For some, D'Angelo's arrest represented closure. For others, it emphasized how much time had been stolen by bureaucratic barriers and technological limitations. The Golden State Killer's story doesn't have a satisfying ending because true crime doesn't offer the narrative closure fiction provides. Victims remain traumatized. Families stay fractured. Communities bear scars that won't fully heal. D'Angelo will die in prison, but his death won't resurrect murdered victims or erase decades of terror. Justice, delayed 40 years, feels less like triumph than acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that evil occurred, that it was witnessed, that society eventually held someone accountable even when that accountability came too late to prevent suffering. Joseph James D'Angelo sits in his prison cell now, an elderly man whose notoriety far exceeds his physical presence. He'll never speak publicly about his crimes, never explain his motivations, never offer the apology victims deserve. He'll die with his secrets, taking to the grave whatever psychological darkness produced his decades of predation. Perhaps that silence is his final act of cruelty, denying closure to people who've been denied too much already. But his capture sends a different message to other predators who assume time guarantees safety. Science advances, techniques improve, databases expand. Cases once considered unsolvable can be resurrected by investigators who refuse to accept that evil deserves permanent impunity. The Golden State Killer terrorized California for over a decade, then hid for 4 more. But hiding isn't the same as escaping, and time doesn't erase evidence. It just delays reckoning. Sleep tight, Sacramento. Sleep tight, Southern California. The monster who haunted your nightmares is caged now. Growing old in a cell he'll never leave. He can't hurt you anymore. He can't prowl your neighborhoods, test your windows, invade your sanctuaries. He's been rendered powerless, exposed, prosecuted, imprisoned for life. But remember what his story teaches. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a uniform, smiles at neighbors, raises families, and performs the ordinary rituals of suburban life. Sometimes the predator isn't a stranger lurking in shadows. It's someone embedded in the community, hiding in plain sight, waiting for opportunity. The Golden State Killer is caught. But the darkness he represented, the capacity for cruelty that exists in certain human psychologies, remains eternal. We catch individual monsters, but we never eliminate the conditions that produce them. We secure our homes, install our alarms, organize our neighborhood watches. And still, occasionally, something slips through, reminding us that safety is always provisional, always temporary, always dependent on vigilance we can't maintain forever. Joseph James D'Angelo proved that evil can be patient, methodical, devastatingly effective. But his capture proved something more important. Justice, though slow, can still arrive. Victims, though traumatized, can still find resolution. Science, though imperfect, can still identify predators who assumed they'd evaded accountability forever. The Golden State Killer's reign of terror is over. But his story will endure, not as entertainment, but as warning. Warning about what humans can become when conscience fails. Warning about how thoroughly monsters can disguise themselves. Warning that the darkness is always there, waiting, testing, looking for the unlocked window, the moment of vulnerability, the opportunity to transform ordinary lives into extraordinary nightmares. And now, decades later, we finally know his name. We finally see his face. We finally have the answer to the question that haunted California for over 40 years. Who was the Golden State Killer? He was Joseph James D'Angelo. He was a police officer. He was a husband and father. He was a neighbor and co-worker and grandfather. He was the monster sleeping next door while everyone assumed monsters only existed in distant places, in fiction, in cautionary tales rather than lived reality. He was proof that evil doesn't need fangs or supernatural powers. Sometimes it just needs a mask, a pair of gloves, and the absolute certainty that ordinary people are remarkably easy to destroy once you breach their fragile sense of security. The Golden State Killer is caught, but the darkness he came from is still there, waiting to produce the next predator, the next nightmare, the next decades-long investigation that will eventually end with another unmasking, another sentencing, another hollow victory that arrives too late to prevent suffering but just in time to prove that evil, no matter how patient, eventually faces reckoning. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Mpumalanga Terror. The roads of Mpumalanga stretched endlessly through South Africa's eastern highlands, where mist clings to mountain passes and travelers disappear without warning. Between 1996 and 1999, these routes became hunting grounds for two men whose names would become synonymous with unspeakable evil. Dumisani Mfatsi and Johannes van Rooyen didn't just kill. They orchestrated a campaign of terror so methodical, so calculated, that investigators would later describe their crime scenes as theaters of deliberate cruelty. Families vanished. Bodies were discovered in states that haunted seasoned detectives for years. And as the body count rose, a terrifying question emerged. How long had they been perfecting their craft before anyone realized a pattern existed? Dumisani Mfatsi was born into poverty in rural KwaZulu-Natal during the apartheid era, a time when systemic oppression ground down millions of black South Africans. His early years remain largely undocumented, lost to a system that rarely kept records on children from townships and rural areas. What emerged from those formative years was a man who understood violence intimately, who had witnessed brutality as both spectator and participant, and who carried within him something that went beyond the trauma of his environment. Those who knew him in passing described a quiet intensity, eyes that seemed to calculate rather than communicate, and a demeanor that made people instinctively maintain distance. Johannes van Rooyen came from a completely different world. A white South African born into relative privilege, van Rooyen had opportunities that Mfatsi never knew. Yet somewhere in his development, something fractured. He found himself drawn to the margins of society, to criminal enterprises and violent associations that his background should have steered him away from. By his mid-20s, van Rooyen had accumulated a criminal record that spoke of escalating aggression, assault, theft, weapons charges. He was a man whose violence was not born of desperation but of preference. The convergence of these two men remains one of the case's most chilling aspects. How they met, what initial conversation sparked their partnership, and how they recognized in each other a willingness to cross boundaries that most humans instinctively respect. These details remain partially obscured. What investigators eventually pieced together was that by 1996, Mfatsi and van Rooyen had formed an alliance built on mutual depravity. They weren't friends in any conventional sense. They were collaborators in violence, each enabling the other's worst impulses, creating a feedback loop of escalating brutality. Their methodology was terrifyingly simple. The highways and rural roads of Mpumalanga carried a steady stream of traffic, families traveling between towns, salespeople making their routes, couples heading to weekend getaways. Many of these roads passed through isolated stretches where assistance was miles away and cell phone coverage was non-existent. Mfatsi and van Rooyen positioned themselves to exploit this vulnerability. They would identify targets at rest stops, at small-town shops, or simply on the road itself. Sometimes they posed as stranded motorists. Other times they would follow vehicles until an opportunity presented itself. The earliest attacks that investigators could definitively link to the pair occurred in 1996, though there remains suspicion that their activities began earlier. These initial crimes already bore the hallmarks of experienced predators. Victims were forced off roads or into secondary locations with practiced efficiency. The attacks weren't impulsive or disorganized. They were methodical. Mfatsi and Van Ruyen worked with a division of labor that suggested planning and rehearsal. One would control victims while the other secured the area. They communicated through gestures and brief commands, operating with the coordination of a tactical unit. What made their crimes particularly horrifying was the extended nature of their attacks. Many serial offenders kill quickly, driven by rage or compulsion that demands immediate release. Mfatsi and Van Ruyen were different. They took their time. Crime scenes revealed that victims were kept alive for extended periods, subjected to torments that served no practical purpose in terms of robbery or escape prevention. This was violence for its own sake, suffering inflicted because the infliction itself satisfied something within these men. The sexual violence component of their crimes was systematic and depraved. Women and girls were targeted specifically, subjected to assaults that investigators documented with clinical precision in reports that became difficult for even experienced professionals to read. These weren't crimes of opportunity or passion. They were predatory, calculated, and repeated with a consistency that spoke of established pattern rather than isolated incidents. Between attacks, Mfatsi and Van Ruyen returned to apparent normalcy. Van Ruyen maintained loose connections to various communities, moving between locations without establishing deep roots anywhere. Mfatsi similarly drifted, working occasional jobs, staying in different places. This transience worked to their advantage. They weren't established residents who would be missed or whose comings and goings would be tracked by concerned neighbors. They were ghosts, present enough to blend in but never stationary enough to be truly known. By 1997, the pattern of disappearances along Mpumalonga's roads had begun to register with law enforcement, though the scale wasn't yet apparent. Individual cases were investigated as isolated incidents, missing persons reports filed, abandoned vehicles catalogued, occasional discoveries of remains treated as separate tragedies. The apartheid-era police force was in transition, merging into the new South African Police Service, and institutional knowledge was fragmented. Communication between different jurisdictions was inconsistent. The idea that a coordinated pair of killers was operating across the province hadn't yet crystallized into official investigation. But among the communities along these roads, fear was spreading through a different network, that of word of mouth, of warnings passed between travelers, of growing reluctance to drive certain routes alone. People began traveling in convoys when possible, avoiding stopping at isolated locations, making note of vehicles that seemed to linger too long at rest stops. This grassroots awareness operated parallel to official investigations, a survival mechanism activated by pattern recognition even before authorities had connected the dots. The critical flaw in Mfatsi and Van Ruyen's approach was one that ultimately dooms most serial offenders: escalation. As their crimes continued, the intervals between attacks shortened. The violence intensified. What had been horrible became even more depraved. They were no longer satisfied with the level of control and harm they'd previously inflicted. They needed more, and with that escalation came increased risk and decreased caution. Their vehicles changed, stolen, borrowed, or acquired through violence. They developed multiple routes through the province, learning which roads offered the best opportunities and which areas had too much police presence. They studied the patterns of potential victims, understanding that certain demographics traveled at certain times for certain reasons. This wasn't random violence. This was predation elevated to a dark science. The psychological profile that would later be developed suggested that neither man could have sustained this campaign alone. Mfatsi provided local knowledge and a certain ruthlessness that came from years of survival in brutal circumstances. Van Ruyen brought a different kind of violence, one rooted in entitlement and a worldview that had been warped by privilege twisted into grievance. Together, they amplified each other's capacity for harm, creating a partnership where each attack pushed the boundaries of what they'd attempt next. By late 1997, the body count was rising, though exact numbers remained uncertain. Some victims were never found. Others were discovered months or years later, remains scattered by animals and weather, identification difficult or impossible. Each discovery opened new wounds in communities already traumatized by loss and fear. Funerals were held for people whose final moments remained horrifyingly unknown. Families lived with questions that had no answers and grief that had no closure. The province's landscape itself seemed to reflect the darkness that had settled over it. Those beautiful mountain passes and endless grasslands now carried an additional weight. Every roadside memorial marked a life ended violently. Every stretch of isolated highway whispered warnings. The sun still rose over Mpumalanga, but it illuminated a territory transformed by terror, where two men continued their hunt and entire communities held their breath, waiting for the horror to end. The year 1998 marked a terrible intensification of Mfatsi and Van Rooyen's campaign. What had been periodic attacks became increasingly frequent, and the nature of the violence evolved into something even more calculated and cruel. Investigators would later establish that this period represented the apex of their activities, a time when they operated with chilling confidence and apparent impunity. One case in particular would come to represent the depths of their depravity: the murder of the Pretorius family. Johannes and Maria Pretorius were traveling with their two children, aged 8 and 11, from their home in Amelo to visit relatives in Nelspruit. It was a journey they'd made dozens of times, a routine trip on a Saturday morning that should have been unremarkable. The family never arrived at their destination. The initial investigation into their disappearance revealed few clues. Their vehicle was found 3 days later, abandoned on a dirt road approximately 40 kilometers from the main highway. The doors were locked, personal belongings remained inside, and there was no immediate sign of violence. For several days, authorities treated it as a missing persons case, hoping for a resolution that would see the family found alive, perhaps victims of a carjacking who had been released unharmed. The truth was vastly more horrific. When hikers discovered the bodies nearly 2 weeks later in a remote area kilometers from where the vehicle had been abandoned, the crime scene told a story of systematic, prolonged violence. The family had been held for an extended period before their deaths. The children's remains showed evidence of restraint marks. Maria Pretorius had been subjected to sexual assault. Johannes showed signs of having been tortured, his injuries suggesting that he'd been kept alive to witness his family's suffering before his own death. The level of planning this crime required was staggering. Mfatsi and Van Rooyen had somehow forced an entire family from their vehicle to a secondary location without leaving obvious evidence of struggle. They'd kept 4 people under control for what investigators estimated was at least 12 to 18 hours. They'd then disposed of the bodies in a location remote enough that discovery took considerable time. This wasn't opportunistic violence. This was orchestrated horror. Detective Captain Andries Mallon of the Mpumalanga Murder and Robbery Unit received the case file on his desk with a sense of sickening familiarity. The Pretorius murders bore similarities to at least 3 other cases he'd been working, similarities that weren't coincidental. Families or couples traveling on provincial roads. Vehicles found abandoned, usually on dirt roads leading away from main routes. Bodies discovered later showing evidence of prolonged captivity and systematic violence. Sexual assault in cases involving women and girls, and a complete absence of witnesses or useful physical evidence. Mallon began constructing what investigators call a linkage analysis, comparing crime scene characteristics, victim profiles, geographic patterns, and temporal spacing. The picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Over a 2-year period, at least 11 incidents bore enough similarities to suggest a common perpetrator or perpetrators. The cases spanned a wide geographic area but clustered along certain corridors. The violence showed consistency in method and escalation in severity. And critically, there were witness reports from multiple locations of 2 men, one black and one white, acting suspiciously at rest stops and rural intersections. The racial composition of the partnership was significant for several reasons. In post-apartheid South Africa, interracial relationships of any kind still carried social complexities. A black man and white man traveling together would be noticed, remembered. Yet somehow Mfatsi and Van Rooyen managed to operate without generating enough consistent witness information to lead to identification. They moved between communities, changed their appearance, varied their vehicles, and maintained enough anonymity to continue hunting. Another case from this period demonstrated their capacity for cold-blooded violence. A traveling salesman named David Khumalo vanished while making his rounds through small towns in the northeastern part of the province. His body was found 3 months later by farm workers clearing brush. He'd been shot execution style, his death relatively quick compared to other victims. But the location of his body, at the bottom of a ravine, carefully concealed under branches and debris, suggested that his killers had taken time to hide him thoroughly. The execution-style killing indicated that Khumalo had served whatever purpose they had for him and was then eliminated efficiently. His vehicle was never recovered, suggesting it had been valuable enough to steal and disguise or sell. The psychological pressure on investigators was immense. Each new case brought media attention, community outcry, and political pressure to solve what was clearly a serial crime pattern. Yet the reality of detective work is that cases are solved through evidence, witnesses, and mistakes by perpetrators. Mfatsi and Van Ruyen were making few mistakes. They left minimal physical evidence. They varied their patterns enough to avoid easy prediction. And they operated in areas where law enforcement resources were stretched thin across vast territories. During this period, Mfatsi and Van Ruyen's partnership revealed its true nature through the crime scene evidence. They didn't merely tolerate each other's presence during attacks. They actively participated together, taking turns, sometimes watching while the other acted, other times working in coordination. This shared engagement in violence created a bond forged in the worst possible foundation, mutual depravity without restraint or conscience. The sexual violence inflicted on female victims showed planning and deliberation. Crime scene analysis revealed that women were restrained in ways that prevented resistance but prolonged their consciousness and awareness. This wasn't about overwhelming victims quickly. It was about maintaining control and extending the duration of the attack. The psychological torture component was as significant as the physical violence, forcing victims to experience extended terror and helplessness before death. Male victims who were part of family groups showed evidence of having been incapacitated in ways that allowed them to witness but not prevent violence against family members. In several cases, forensic analysis suggested that fathers and husbands had been wounded non-lethally and restrained where they could see but not intervene as their wives and daughters were assaulted. This deliberate amplification of suffering went beyond practical crime requirements into territory that spoke of profound sadism. Children were not spared. This represents one of the most difficult aspects of the case to document or discuss. Several child victims showed evidence of violence so extreme that investigators required counseling to process what they documented. The deaths of children in these attacks appeared to have been relatively quick compared to adult victims, suggesting either a vestigial moral boundary or simply practical calculation about managing multiple victims. The geographic pattern of attacks showed sophistication. Mfatsi and Van Ruyen never struck in the same immediate area twice in succession. They would commit crimes in the northern part of the province, then move south. They'd strike along eastern routes, then shift west. This movement pattern made it difficult for local police to predict their next target area. It also meant that multiple police jurisdictions were involved, with coordination challenges that the killers seemed to understand and exploit. By mid-1998, the task force assembled to investigate these crimes had grown to include detectives from multiple units and specialist investigators from national headquarters. They were working with limited resources. The new South African Police Service was still developing its systems, and forensic capabilities were not yet at the level they would reach in later years. But dedicated investigators like Captain Mallon were committed to stopping these killers, working long hours, sacrificing personal time, driven by the knowledge that every day these men remained free was a day potential victims were at risk. The emotional toll on investigators was substantial. Veteran detectives who had seen countless crime scenes during apartheid-era violence and in the turbulent transition period found these cases uniquely disturbing. The calculated nature of the violence, the extended duration of victim suffering, the deliberate infliction of psychological as well as physical harm, these elements created a profile of perpetrators operating without conscience or empathy. Community responses varied across the affected areas. In some towns, vigilante sentiments emerged, with armed groups conducting roadway patrols and stopping vehicles that aroused suspicion. This created additional challenges for police, who had to manage community fear while also preventing extralegal violence. In other areas, people simply stopped traveling certain routes, devastating small businesses that depended on through traffic and isolating communities that relied on connection to larger towns. The media coverage of the cases was extensive but often speculative. Newspapers ran headlines about highway killers and monster predators. Television reports showed tearful family members pleading for information. The pressure on police to solve these cases became intense, with politicians demanding results and communities expecting protection that proved difficult to provide across such vast, rural territories. What the public didn't fully understand was that Mfatsi and Van Ruyen were operating in an environment tailor-made for their crimes. Vast, empty spaces, long stretches of road between communities, limited police presence in rural areas, cell phone coverage that was spotty at best, and a general population still adjusting to post-apartheid realities, with many people traveling routes and taking risks they wouldn't have considered before. As 1998 drew toward its close, the task force had developed a comprehensive profile of the killers but still lacked identifications. They knew they were looking for two men, likely one black and one white, who worked together with practiced coordination. They knew the killers had access to weapons and likely had criminal experience. They knew the attacks followed certain patterns related to victim selection and geographic location. What they didn't know were names, faces, or where these men would strike next. The final weeks of 1998 brought a slight lull in attacks, leading some investigators to hope the perpetrators had either left the province, been arrested for other crimes, or met their own violent ends. But those familiar with serial offender patterns knew better. The lull more likely represented a cooling-off period or a time when the killers had moved to other areas temporarily. The task force remained vigilant, knowing that men who had killed so many times, who had refined their methods over years, weren't likely to simply stop. January 1999 began with a sense of foreboding across Mpumalanga's law enforcement community. The relative quiet of late 1998 hadn't brought relief. It had brought anxiety about when and where the killers would strike again. That answer came with devastating swiftness. On January 9th, a young couple, Thabo and Lindai Nkosi, newly married and traveling to their honeymoon destination near the Kruger National Park, vanished between the towns of Witbank and Middelburg. Their vehicle was found 2 days later on an abandoned farm road, wiped clean of fingerprints, empty of personal belongings. The discovery sent chills through the investigative team because the characteristics matched the established pattern perfectly. The search for the Nkosis mobilized hundreds of volunteers alongside police search teams. The media coverage was extensive. A young couple just beginning their lives together, last seen at a petrol station where CCTV footage showed them happy and affectionate, filling their car and purchasing snacks for their journey. The footage also showed something else. A white sedan pulling into the station minutes after the couple left, containing two men who seemed to watch the Nkosis departure with interest. Detective Captain Mallon reviewed that footage dozens of times, enhancing it as much as available technology allowed. The faces of the two men in the sedan were partially obscured, but the vehicle was distinctive. A Toyota Corolla with visible damage to the front bumper and a particular pattern of rust on the driver's door. For the first time in the investigation, they had something concrete. A vehicle description tied to a specific incident with video documentation. The breakthrough came not from sophisticated investigation techniques, but from an alert patrol officer in the town of Amolo. Constable Thembiso Ndlovu was conducting routine traffic monitoring when she noticed a white Toyota Corolla matching the description from the bulletin. The vehicle was parked outside a shabby boarding house, and two men sat inside, appearing to watch the street. Ndlovu radioed for backup and maintained observation from a discreet distance. When additional officers arrived and approached the vehicle, both men exited quickly and attempted to flee on foot. Ndlovu, showing remarkable courage and quick thinking, moved to intercept the black suspect while her colleagues pursued the white male. A brief chase through residential streets ended with both men in custody. Their arrest was unremarkable in its execution. No gunfight, no dramatic confrontation. Just two men who ran when approached by police and who were apprehended through coordinated effort. The men provided false names initially. They carried no identification. The vehicle they'd been using was stolen, its registration plates taken from another car. But when investigators searched the boarding house room the men had been renting, the evidence they discovered left no doubt about who they had in custody. The room was a catalog of horror. Personal items belonging to multiple missing persons were carefully organized on shelves and in drawers. Jewelry that family members would later identify as belonging to victims. Identification documents and driver's licenses taken as trophies. Photographs of crime scenes that the killers had apparently taken to revisit their acts. And most damning, a spiral-bound notebook containing detailed entries describing attacks, including dates, locations, and descriptions of victims and what had been done to them. The notebook was written in 2 different handwriting styles, suggesting both men contributed to it. The entries were matter-of-fact, clinical even, describing acts of extreme violence in language devoid of emotion or humanity. Reading it, investigators confronted the reality that these men had documented their crimes like accountants logging transactions, treating murder and torture as events to be recorded and remembered. Forensic analysis of items from the room provided physical evidence linking both suspects to multiple crime scenes. Blood residue on clothing matched victim DNA. Soil samples on boots matched locations where bodies had been discovered. Ballistic analysis of a firearm found hidden in the room matched bullets recovered from several victims. The evidentiary chain was comprehensive and devastating. Under interrogation, the men initially maintained silence. But as the evidence mounted and they realized the impossibility of denial, Dumisani Mfatsi began to talk. What emerged over hours of recorded interviews was a confession so detailed and disturbing that investigators found themselves simultaneously grateful for the information and traumatized by hearing it directly from the perpetrator. Mfatsi described the partnership with Johannes van Ruyen in transactional terms. They had met through criminal associations in 1995, discovered shared interests in violence and sexual sadism, and decided to work together because each provided capabilities the other lacked. Mfatsi had knowledge of rural areas and communities. Van Ruyen had access to weapons and vehicles. Together, they had created a mobile hunting operation that targeted vulnerable travelers across vast territories. The methodology Mfatsi described was chillingly systematic. They would identify potential victims through observation, following vehicles until isolated opportunities presented themselves. They'd force vehicles off roads through various tactics, sometimes simulating a breakdown, other times using vehicle maneuvers to create accidents. Once they had control of victims, they'd drive them to pre-scouted secondary locations where they could take their time. The duration of attacks varied depending on circumstances and how many victims they'd taken. Single individuals might be killed relatively quickly after robbery and, in the case of women, sexual assault. Families were kept longer, sometimes for more than 24 hours, as Mfatsi and Van Ruyen systematically victimized each member. The deliberate pacing of these attacks spoke to a sadistic pleasure in control and suffering rather than any practical criminal objective. Mfatsi estimated they had killed more than 20 people, though he couldn't provide exact numbers for some time periods. Some victims were opportunity targets who hadn't been part of any plan. Others were specifically selected based on characteristics that appealed to the killers. The randomness of victim selection, anyone could become a target simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, made the crimes even more terrifying in their implications. Van Ruyen, unlike his partner, never provided a full confession. He admitted to some involvement in robberies but attempted to minimize his participation in murders and sexual violence, claiming he had been coerced by Mfatsi. This defense strategy was transparently false given the physical evidence, witness statements, and the contents of the shared notebook, but Van Ruyen maintained variations of this narrative throughout the legal proceedings. The arrest brought simultaneous relief and grief to communities across Mpumalanga. Relief that the killers were in custody, that the immediate threat was ended, but also renewed grief as families who had been waiting for answers about missing loved ones now received confirmation of deaths and heard details of final suffering that no one should have to hear about people they loved. The Nkosi family's worst fears were confirmed when searchers, guided by information from Mfatsi, found Thabo and Lindau's bodies in a ravine 30 kilometers from where their vehicle had been abandoned. The young couple had been subjected to the full spectrum of Mfatsi and Van Rooyen's violence before being killed. Their deaths, like so many others, served no purpose beyond satisfying the killer's desires for suffering and control. As investigators worked to identify all victims and match them to Mfatsi's descriptions, the full scope of the killing spree became apparent. Confirmed victims numbered at least 22 individuals, ranging in age from 6 years old to 68. The geographic spread covered much of Mpumalanga and portions of neighboring provinces. The timeline stretched from 1996 through early 1999, with strong suspicions that activities may have begun earlier but couldn't be definitively linked. The psychological profiles developed by forensic psychologists painted a portrait of two profoundly dangerous individuals whose partnership had enabled escalation that might not have occurred if they'd remained isolated. Mfatsi showed characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder, demonstrating no empathy for victims and describing violence in completely detached terms. Van Rooyen exhibited similar traits, but with additional elements of sexual sadism and a particular hostility toward women that manifested in especially brutal treatment of female victims. The legal proceedings began with intense media scrutiny and public attention. The state assembled a prosecution team led by advocate Sarah Mthembu, an experienced prosecutor known for handling complex murder cases. The evidence was voluminous: forensic reports, victim identification documents, witness statements, the recovered notebook, recorded confessions from Mfatsi, and extensive physical evidence linking both men to multiple crime scenes. The defense faced a nearly impossible task. Both men were assigned legal representation, as is the right of all accused regardless of the charges. Their attorneys could do little beyond ensuring procedural correctness and attempting to argue for mercy during sentencing. The evidence against Mfatsi and Van Rooyen was overwhelming and conclusive. The trial, held in the Mpumalanga High Court in Nelspruit, became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in South African legal history. Family members of victims filled the public gallery daily, some openly weeping as evidence was presented, others sitting in stony silence, faces etched with pain and rage. The testimony of forensic experts describing crime scenes and autopsy findings was so disturbing that several jurors requested counseling during the trial. Mfatsi showed no visible emotion throughout most proceedings, sitting impassively as witnesses described the devastation he'd caused. Van Rooyen displayed more anxiety, occasionally shaking his head at testimony, but still projecting an attitude of detachment from the gravity of the charges. Neither man testified in their own defense, their attorneys wisely recognizing that putting them on the stand would only provide opportunities for further damaging admissions. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. Each victim was identified, their life and family described, the evidence of their murder presented. This wasn't just a recitation of facts, it was a restoration of humanity to people who had been treated as objects by their killers. The court heard about Johannes Pretorius, who had worked as a mechanic and coached youth soccer, about Maria Pretorius, a schoolteacher beloved by her students, about their children whose lives ended before they'd barely begun, about David Kumalo, whose dedication to supporting his extended family through his sales work made his loss devastating to dozens of people, about Thabo and Lindai Nkosi, whose love story ended in unthinkable horror. The verdict, when it came after weeks of testimony and evidence, surprised no one. Both Dumisani Mfatsi and Johannes Van Rooyen were found guilty on multiple counts of murder, rape, robbery, and kidnapping. The convictions covered 22 confirmed victims, though the judge acknowledged in his remarks that the true number of victims was likely higher. The sentencing phase of the trial carried its own weight of expectation and emotion. Under South African law, even the most heinous crimes no longer carried the death penalty. It had been abolished with the new constitution adopted after apartheid's end. This meant that regardless of the magnitude of their crimes, Mfatsi and Van Rooyen would face life imprisonment rather than execution. For many victim family members, this was a source of frustration and pain, feeling that life sentences, however lengthy, couldn't match the brutality of what had been done to their loved ones. Judge Marthinus van der Merwe, presiding over the sentencing, delivered remarks that resonated throughout the courtroom and beyond. He described the crimes as representing evil in its purest form, noting that the deliberate, prolonged nature of the violence against innocent people, including children, placed these offenses among the most serious in South African criminal history. He emphasized that the crimes weren't committed in moments of passion or under circumstances of diminished capacity. They were planned, repeated, and executed with cold calculation over an extended period. The judge sentenced both men to multiple life terms, to be served consecutively rather than concurrently. This meant that Mfatsi received 22 life sentences plus additional years for related crimes, with a determination that he must serve a minimum of 550 years before being eligible for parole consideration. Van Rooyen received similar sentencing with a minimum of 525 years. These numbers, while technically allowing for theoretical parole eligibility, effectively ensured both men would die in prison. The judge specified that the sentences should reflect society's absolute rejection of such violence and serve as a deterrent, though he acknowledged that individuals capable of these crimes likely couldn't be deterred through normal legal mechanisms. As the sentences were pronounced, reactions in the courtroom varied. Some family members wept with relief that justice, in whatever form available, had been served. Others sat in continued silence, the verdicts and sentences providing no real comfort against the enormity of their losses. A few shouted at the convicted men, expressions of rage and grief that court security allowed briefly before restoring order. Mfatsi and Van Rooyen showed minimal reaction, both men seeming to have mentally withdrawn to whatever internal spaces they inhabited. The aftermath of the trial involved extensive victim identification efforts that continued for months. Not all victims could be definitively identified. Some remains were too degraded. Some descriptions in Mfatsi's confession couldn't be matched to specific missing persons reports, and some families never came forward, either unaware of the connection or unable to face the confirmation of their worst fears. The task force worked to provide closure wherever possible, exhuming remains for DNA analysis, reviewing old missing persons cases for possible connections, and reaching out to families across the affected provinces. The psychological impact on the communities of Mpumalanga was profound and long-lasting. The sense of violation ran deeper than fear of physical danger. These crimes had attacked fundamental assumptions about safety and trust. Parents who had allowed teenage children to travel between towns now questioned every decision they'd made. Couples who had taken romantic drives through beautiful landscapes now saw those same places as potential death sites. The social fabric that connects communities through movement and interaction had been torn, and repairing it would take years. Law enforcement agencies conducted extensive reviews of how the crimes had been able to continue for so long without earlier intervention. These reviews, while painful, revealed important systemic issues. Communication between different police jurisdictions had been inadequate. The transition from apartheid-era policing to the new national service had created gaps in institutional knowledge and coordination. Forensic capabilities weren't at the level needed to quickly analyze evidence and identify patterns. And resource allocation to rural areas was insufficient given the geographic scope that needed coverage. Reforms followed from these reviews. Enhanced communication systems were implemented to allow better information sharing between jurisdictions. Training programs were developed to help investigators recognize patterns in serial crimes. Forensic laboratory capabilities were expanded, and patrol strategies for rural areas were revised to increase presence on high-risk routes. These changes couldn't undo past tragedies, but they represented attempts to ensure that similar crime sprees would be identified and stopped more quickly in the future. The officers and investigators who had worked the cases faced their own reckoning with what they'd witnessed and documented. Detective Captain Andries Mallon, who had led the investigative task force, later spoke publicly about the psychological toll of working with such disturbing material. Several investigators required extended counseling. Some transferred to different units, unable to continue working homicide cases after what they'd experienced. Others remained in their roles, driven by commitment to justice but carrying permanent scars from confronting human evil so directly. Mfatsi and Van Rooyen were sent to different maximum security prisons, separated to prevent any continuation of their partnership and for their own protection. In South African prisons, certain crimes mark inmates for particular danger from other prisoners. Crimes against children especially carry this stigma. Both men required segregated housing for their safety, spending most of their time in isolation from the general prison population. Over subsequent years, both men would seek appeal and parole consideration through various legal mechanisms. Every such application was denied. The nature of their crimes, the number of victims, the complete absence of rehabilitative factors, and the ongoing danger they represented to society made any prospect of release impossible. The parole board reviews became routine exercises in rejection, with victim family members often submitting impact statements to ensure decision-makers remembered the human cost of these crimes. Mfatsi gave several interviews from prison to criminologists and psychologists studying serial offenders. These interviews provided disturbing insights into his mindset, but no real answers to the question of why. He described the killings in detached terms, acknowledging responsibility while showing no genuine remorse. When asked about victims, he displayed no empathy, sometimes seeming annoyed by questions about their suffering. Psychologists concluded that his lack of conscience wasn't something that could be treated or reformed. It was a fundamental absence of normal human emotional responses. Van Ruyen remained more closed, giving fewer interviews and maintaining variations of his trial position that his involvement had been less extensive than evidence demonstrated. This ongoing denial prevented any meaningful examination of his motivations or psychology. He did make occasional statements attempting to shift blame entirely to Mfatsi, claims that were transparently self-serving and contradicted by overwhelming evidence of his active, enthusiastic participation in the crimes. The families of victims formed support networks that persisted years after the trial ended. These groups provided spaces for shared grief and mutual understanding among people connected by the worst possible circumstances. They advocated for victim rights, supported each other through anniversaries and triggering events, and worked to ensure their loved ones were remembered as people who had lived full lives, not just as crime statistics. Memorials were established at several locations across Mpumalanga. These weren't at crime scenes. Families wanted to avoid creating macabre tourist destinations, but rather in community spaces where victims had lived and been known. A memorial garden in Amelo honored the Pretorius family, with 4 trees planted and plaques describing Johannes, Maria, and their children as beloved community members. Similar memorials elsewhere recognized other victims, reclaiming their narratives from the violence that had ended their lives. The media's relationship with the case evolved over time. Initial coverage had been sensationalistic, focused on the horror and brutality. But as years passed, more thoughtful examinations emerged. Documentaries explored systemic factors that had enabled the crimes. Journalists interviewed investigators, families, and experts to provide context beyond shock value. The case became a subject of criminology studies, examining partnership dynamics in serial offenders, the challenges of policing vast rural territories, and the intersection of violence with South Africa's complex social landscape during the transition from apartheid. Academic researchers found the Mfatsi Van Ruyen case particularly significant for several reasons. The interracial partnership challenged assumptions about how serial killers operate. The extended timeline and high victim count demonstrated how rural environments can provide cover for predators. The methodical documentation in their notebook offered rare insight into how some offenders think about and remember their crimes. And the investigation's eventual success, despite numerous challenges, provided lessons about persistence and interagency cooperation. The broader South African society grappled with what the case revealed about violence and safety in the post-apartheid era. The crimes had occurred during a time of tremendous social change and optimism about the country's future. That such extreme violence could persist for years across populated areas was deeply disturbing to national self-conception. It prompted difficult conversations about crime, policing, and the legacies of violence that couldn't be resolved simply through political transformation. For the province of Mpumalanga specifically, recovery involved conscious effort to reclaim the landscape from association with terror. Tourism officials worked to promote the region's natural beauty without ignoring its history. Travel safety improved through infrastructure investments and enhanced police presence. Slowly, the psychological geography shifted. Roads became routes again rather than danger zones, though certain stretches would always carry memories for those who had lived through that period. Dumisani Mfatsi died in prison in 2018 from complications related to tuberculosis, a disease prevalent in South African correctional facilities. His death received minimal media attention, a brief notice in newspapers rather than the extensive coverage his crimes had generated. Victim families learned of it through official notifications. Some expressed relief that he could never be released. Others felt nothing, his death changing nothing about their losses. A few noted the irony that he died of disease rather than violence, afforded a more peaceful end than he'd given to any of his victims. Johannes van Rooyen remains incarcerated as of this writing. Now elderly and in declining health, he continues serving his sentence at a facility that houses aging and infirm prisoners. He has been denied parole at every review hearing. His most recent petition claimed rehabilitation and remorse, but the parole board found no credible evidence of genuine transformation. The psychological evaluations conducted for parole purposes consistently conclude he remains dangerous and incapable of functioning safely in society. The case files from the investigation, numbering thousands of pages, remain in official archives. They serve as training material for new detectives, studied examples of complex investigations requiring coordination and perseverance. The most disturbing elements, crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, the killer's notebook, are restricted access, available only to investigators and researchers with specific professional needs. Even hardened professionals who review these materials comment on their exceptional brutality. Detective Captain Mallon, now retired, occasionally speaks to law enforcement groups about the investigation. He emphasizes that solving serial cases requires both systematic methodology and intuitive pattern recognition. He credits the team effort that brought Mfatsi and Van Rooyen to justice, noting that Constable Ndlovu's alert observation was as crucial as any forensic analysis. He also speaks honestly about the cost of such investigations on those who conduct them, the nightmares that persist, the way certain details remain vivid decades later. The families continue living with absence. Parents who lost children struggle through what should have been milestone birthdays, graduations, weddings. Siblings who lost brothers or sisters carry guilt about surviving and questions about what might have been. Children who lost parents navigate life without the guidance they desperately needed. These ongoing impacts don't appear in sentencing documents or case statistics, but they represent the true measure of what was destroyed. Some families found ways to channel their grief into action. Several became advocates for victim rights, working to ensure that survivors of violent crime receive adequate support and that their voices carry weight in legal proceedings. Others focused on violence prevention, speaking to youth groups about recognizing danger and making safe choices. These activities provided purpose and meaning, though they could never replace what was lost. The broader questions raised by the case remain partially unanswered. What creates individuals capable of such sustained, calculated violence? How can societies identify and intervene with potential offenders before they act? What responsibilities do communities bear for monitoring and reporting suspicious behavior? How should justice systems balance punishment, deterrence, and protection in dealing with the most extreme offenders? These philosophical and practical questions continue generating debate among criminologists, ethicists, and policymakers. The phenomenon of serial murder itself, while statistically rare, holds outsized psychological weight in public consciousness. Cases like Mfatsi and Van Rooyen's tap into primal fears about predation and the existence of humans who lack normal moral constraints. They challenge comfortable assumptions that most people are fundamentally decent and that evil requires extraordinary circumstances to manifest. The reality that such individuals exist, operate among us, and can evade detection for extended periods is deeply unsettling. In Mpumalanga today, a new generation travels the same roads where these crimes occurred. Most have only vague awareness of the history, if any. Life has moved forward as it must. But those who remember, who lived through that period of fear, who lost loved ones or new victims, carry the knowledge differently. They understand that beautiful landscapes can conceal terrible secrets, that strangers offering help might harbor the worst intentions, that safety is provisional and precious, never to be taken for granted. The memorial sites established for victims receive fewer visitors with each passing year. Fresh flowers appear less frequently, but on certain dates, anniversaries of deaths, birthdays, holidays, family members still come. They sit in quiet reflection. They speak to those who can't answer. They remember lives that deserve to be remembered as more than footnotes in a crime story. The criminal justice system processed Mfatsi and Van Ruyen through its mechanisms and delivered the maximum available punishment. The investigation demonstrated that persistence and coordination could eventually identify and capture even sophisticated offenders. The reforms implemented afterward improved capabilities for future cases. By institutional measures, the system worked, albeit slowly and at tremendous cost. But justice, in the deeper sense that victims and families seek, remained elusive. No sentence could balance the scales of what was done. No punishment could undo the suffering inflicted. No apology, even if genuine rather than the hollow words of convicted killers, could heal wounds that penetrated to the core of human experience. The legal system could remove threats from society and provide some measure of closure, but it couldn't restore what was taken or make sense of senseless violence. The final accounting of the Mfatsi Van Ruyen case includes at least 22 confirmed murders, with strong evidence suggesting additional victims never identified. It includes hundreds of family members and friends whose lives were permanently altered by loss and grief. It includes communities that lost their sense of security and investigators who bore witness to humanity's darkest capabilities. It includes reforms to policing and victim services that emerged from tragedy. And it includes ongoing questions about how societies create, enable, or prevent such extreme violence. What the case ultimately demonstrates is both the worst and, in some limited ways, the best of human nature. The worst, that individuals can be so devoid of empathy, so oriented toward causing suffering, that they kill repeatedly without remorse. The best, that communities support each other through tragedy, that investigators persist despite overwhelming difficulty and emotional cost, that justice systems, however imperfect, work toward accountability, and that survivors find ways to continue despite unimaginable loss. The story doesn't have a satisfying ending because such stories can't. The damage was too extensive, the losses too profound. Mfatsi and Van Ruyen were stopped, prosecuted, and imprisoned. That represents success in stopping the immediate threat. But it doesn't represent triumph or resolution. It represents only that these particular predators were eventually caught and removed from the positions where they could continue hunting. For those who walk the paths where victims died, who drive the roads where attacks occurred, who carry memories of people who should still be alive, for them the case never really ends. It remains a permanent part of their landscape, both physical and emotional. The places remain beautiful. The sun still rises over Mpumalanga. But beneath that beauty lies the knowledge of what happened there, what two men did over years, and how many lives were destroyed before they were finally stopped. The case files will eventually be sealed, moved to deeper archives as active reference needs decline. The last family members who personally knew victims will eventually pass away. The physical evidence preserved from investigations will degrade over time. The memories will fade into history, studied by future criminologists as a historical case rather than a contemporary reality. But the fundamental questions persist. How do we protect the innocent from those who would harm them? How do we build societies where such violence becomes less possible? How do we maintain our own humanity while confronting those who have abandoned theirs? And how do we remember victims not just as casualties of crime, but as full, complete people whose lives had value beyond the violence that ended them? These questions have no simple answers. They require ongoing attention, continued effort, and sustained commitment to building safer, more just communities. The Mfatsi Van Ruyen case stands as both warning and lesson. Warning about the capacity for evil that exists in some individuals, and lesson about the importance of vigilance, coordination, and support for those affected by violence. In the end, this story is about the fragility of safety, the determination of investigators who work to protect it, the resilience of survivors who rebuild after it's shattered, and the memory of victims whose lives deserved so much more than the cruel endings they received. It's a story that needed to be told, not to sensationalize horror, but to honor those who suffered, to acknowledge those who worked for justice, and to remind us all of both the darkness that can exist in human hearts and the light that persists in responding to it. The roads of Mpumalanga stretch on, carrying new travelers through landscapes that have witnessed both terrible violence and remarkable beauty. The province continues forward, carrying its history but not defined by it. And somewhere in the balance between remembering and moving forward, justice, incomplete and imperfect but real, continues to be served through the continued imprisonment of those responsible and the continued remembrance of those they destroyed. This is the story of how darkness fell across a province, how it was finally lifted, and how communities continue living in the aftermath, carrying both the weight of what happened and the determination that such horrors must never be allowed to happen again. 25 years after the arrests, Mpumalanga province has transformed in many ways. Modern highways with improved lighting and emergency call systems have replaced some of the isolated rural roads where attacks occurred. Cell phone coverage blankets areas that were communication dead zones. Police presence has increased, with specialized units focused on highway safety and rapid response to incidents. GPS tracking and vehicle location services provide security measures that didn't exist in the 1990s. Yet the fundamentals remain unchanged. People still travel between towns, still stop at rest areas, still trust that most human interactions will be benign rather than dangerous. Because the alternative, living in constant suspicion and fear, would represent its own kind of defeat. The statistical reality is that most people are decent, most interactions are safe, and most journeys end without incident. But the Mfatsi Van Ruyen case endures as a reminder that statistics don't protect individuals, that exceptions to general safety exist, and that vigilance remains necessary. It's a case that changed how a generation of South Africans thought about travel safety, crime prevention, and the reality that monsters sometimes do exist, walking among us in human form. The memorial garden in Amullo, honoring the Pretorius family, remains maintained by community volunteers. Fresh flowers still appear on significant dates, and on a plaque beneath 4 trees that have grown strong and tall over the years, names are inscribed: Johannes, Maria, and their children, remembered not for how they died but for how they lived, loved, and were loved by those who still carry their memory forward. That, perhaps, is the only meaningful victory that can be claimed from such tragedy. That victims are remembered as people, not just as casualties. That their lives are honored even as the circumstances of their deaths are acknowledged. That justice, however inadequate to the task of restoring what was lost, was pursued with dedication and ultimately achieved. And that communities, scarred but surviving, continue forward with both caution born of painful experience and hope that such darkness won't be allowed to prevail again. The case is closed. The perpetrators will die in prison, but the impacts ripple forward through time, touching families, communities, and a nation still grappling with violence, justice, and the challenge of creating safety in a complex, difficult world. This is their story, the victims who deserved so much better, the families who endured unimaginable pain, the investigators who wouldn't give up, and the communities that refused to let fear have the final word. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 4, The Butcher's Basement, The Unspeakable Horrors of Robert Berdella. Summer heat pressed against Kansas City like a predator's breath in 1988, but nothing could match the temperature of evil that festered behind the ordinary brick walls at 4315 Charlotte Street. For 6 years, neighbors walked their dogs past a modest 2-story house, completely unaware that below their feet, separated only by concrete and darkness, young men were experiencing torture so savage, so methodically cruel, that even hardened homicide detectives would require therapy after reading the case files. Robert Berdella wasn't just a killer. He was an architect of agony, a curator of suffering who transformed human beings into experiments, keeping detailed logs of every scream, every injection, every electrical shock delivered to their bodies. His victims didn't simply die. They endured days, sometimes weeks, of systematic brutalization that stripped away their humanity piece by excruciating piece. What police discovered when they finally breached his door would redefine the very concept of murder in American criminal history. The photographs alone, hundreds of them, documented a descent into hell so complete, so thoroughly planned, that prosecutors struggled to find adequate words during trial. This is not merely a story about death. This is an exploration of what happens when a human soul becomes so corrupted, so absolutely devoid of mercy, that the boundary between life and death transforms into a prolonged nightmare lasting weeks. Prepare yourself, because what transpired in that Kansas City house of horrors will challenge everything you thought you knew about the depths of human depravity. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. entered the world on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, a beginning so unremarkably average that it made his eventual transformation into one of America's most sadistic serial killers all the more terrifying. His early years painted the portrait of suburban normalcy. A Catholic upbringing, a father who worked steadily, a mother who maintained their household. Yet something fundamental existed askew within young Robert, something that wouldn't fully reveal itself until decades later when investigators would piece together the psychological architecture of a monster. His childhood wasn't marked by the obvious red flags that often characterize future killers. There were no animal torture incidents on record, no fire set, no blatant cruelty that would have raised immediate alarm. Instead, Berdella's darkness grew quietly, like mold spreading behind walls, invisible until the structure itself began to collapse. His father died when Robert was 16, a loss that created fractures in his developing psyche that would widen into chasms. He struggled with his sexuality in an era when being gay carried devastating social consequences, creating an internal pressure cooker of shame, rage, and confusion. After high school, Berdella briefly attended the Kansas City Art Institute, nurturing dreams of becoming a professor. He possessed genuine artistic talent and a fascination with artifacts, particularly those from tribal cultures. This interest would later manifest in grotesque ways. His victims would become objects in his own twisted collection, their suffering documented with the same detached precision an anthropologist might use to catalog ancient pottery shards. By the late 1970s, Berdella had abandoned his academic aspirations and opened Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, a booth at the Westport Flea Market where he sold occult paraphernalia, artifacts, and curiosities. Customers remembered him as knowledgeable, articulate, even charming. He could discuss art history and primitive cultures with impressive depth. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses and receding hairline, Berdella seemed like countless other quirky shop owners in America's urban neighborhoods. Slightly eccentric, harmlessly nerdy, utterly forgettable. What none of them realized was that Robert Berdella had begun acquiring different types of curiosities. Prescription medications, veterinary supplies, syringes, and restraints. He studied human anatomy with the dedication of a medical student, but his curriculum focused on pain thresholds, stress positions, and the limits of human endurance. His small house on Charlotte Street, purchased in 1982, would become his laboratory. The neighborhood itself contributed to Berdella's success as a predator. Charlotte Street sat in a transitional area of Kansas City where working-class families lived alongside rental properties housing transient populations. People came and went. Screams in the night could be attributed to domestic disputes or drunken arguments. Nobody wanted to get involved. This social fabric of deliberate ignorance provided perfect camouflage for atrocities. Berdella's hunting grounds extended to areas frequented by vulnerable young men, runaways, male prostitutes, drug addicts, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive police investigations. He understood that society's marginalized populations made perfect victims precisely because society had already decided they mattered less. This calculated selection of prey revealed a predator who thought strategically, who planned meticulously, who understood that his greatest weapon wasn't physical strength but rather the social invisibility of those he targeted. His modus operandi began taking shape in 1984, though investigators would later suspect earlier victims whose remains were never recovered or identified. Berdella would invite young men to his home, usually under friendly pretenses, a place to crash, a job opportunity, a party. Once inside, he would offer them drinks spiked with animal tranquilizers. As the drugs took effect and his victim's motor control deteriorated, Berdella would strike. The basement became his theater of torture. He had prepared it with methodical precision. A mattress, restraints anchored to walls and ceiling, a temperature he could control, and complete soundproofing that transformed screams into silence beyond those walls. Once a victim regained consciousness, groggy, confused, terrified. They would discover themselves naked, bound, and completely at the mercy of a man whose eyes now reflected something no longer quite human. Berdella's torture methodology revealed a mind that found pleasure not in quick violence but in prolonged control and suffering. He would inject his victims' necks and shoulders with various substances including chlorpromazine and antibiotics, experimenting with dosages and combinations. He used cotton swabs soaked in drain cleaner to destroy their vocal cords, rendering them unable to scream for help. He administered electrical shocks to their genitals and other sensitive areas. He inserted objects into their rectums, causing internal injuries that would gradually lead to septic shock and organ failure. But perhaps most chilling was his documentation. Berdella maintained detailed written logs noting times, dosages, victims' reactions, and his own observations. He photographed everything, hundreds of Polaroids capturing every stage of degradation and suffering. These weren't merely trophies. They were scientific records in his disturbed mind, documentation of experiments conducted on human subjects who had been reduced to specimens. His first confirmed victim was Jerry Howell, a 19-year-old Berdella had known previously. In July 1984, after a gathering at Berdella's home, Howell became the inaugural subject in this house of horrors. The torture lasted approximately 28 hours before Howell died from a combination of suffocation and drug overdose. Berdella dismembered the body, double-bagging the parts, and disposed of them in trash bags placed with his regular garbage collection. A method so audaciously simple that it succeeded completely. Jerry Howell's disappearance generated minimal investigation. He was known to be transient, unreliable. His family filed a missing persons report that joined thousands of others in filing cabinets across the country. No one suspected the friendly flea market vendor who had reported Howell's suspicious behavior before his disappearance, positioning himself as a concerned citizen rather than predator. Emboldened by success, Berdella refined his methodology. His second victim was Robert Sheldon, 23, who vanished in April 1985. Sheldon endured approximately 48 hours of torture before dying from a combination of anal trauma and drug toxicity. Again, dismemberment. Again, disposal via routine trash collection. Again, no significant investigation. The pattern had been established, and with each successful disposal, Berdella's confidence grew. He had discovered something intoxicating, absolute power over another human being. The ability to inflict suffering without consequence. The transformation of living, breathing people into objects that existed solely for his gratification. The monster had fully emerged from behind the shopkeeper's facade, and he was just beginning to satisfy his hunger. The period between 1985 and 1987 marked Robert Berdella's most prolific killing phase, a nightmarish crescendo of violence that claimed multiple lives and left permanent scars on those who would later investigate his crimes. Each victim endured experiences that transcended conventional understanding of murder. These weren't simply deaths, but rather extended periods of captivity where torture became a daily ritual, where hope extinguished slowly like oxygen disappearing from a sealed room. Mark Wallace became Berdella's third confirmed victim in June 1985. Wallace, a 20-year-old with substance abuse issues, had known Berdella casually through Kansas City's street culture. When Berdella offered him a place to stay, Wallace accepted, unaware he was walking into meticulously prepared hell. The torture Wallace endured lasted approximately 72 hours, significantly longer than previous victims, suggesting Berdella was refining his technique to extend suffering. According to the detailed logs Berdella maintained, Wallace received repeated injections of animal tranquilizers and experimental dosages of various sedatives. Berdella documented applying drain cleaner to Wallace's vocal cords, permanently silencing his screams. He photographed Wallace in various states of restraint, the images capturing progressive deterioration, physical, mental, emotional. The photographs showed a young man whose eyes transformed from terrified to hollow, the light of consciousness dimming as Berdella's experiments continued. Wallace died from a combination of factors: infected wounds from repeated injections, internal injuries from objects forcibly inserted into his body, and ultimately cardiovascular failure as his traumatized system simply surrendered. Berdella dismembered the corpse with a knife and saw, working in his basement with the casual efficiency of someone breaking down butchered meat. The remains went into trash bags, distributed across multiple garbage collection days to avoid suspicion from heavy bags. Walter James Ferris, a 27-year-old male prostitute, disappeared in September 1985. Ferris had advertised his services, and Berdella responded, arranging a meeting that Ferris believed would be a standard transaction. Instead, he found himself drugged, bound, and subjected to torments that lasted approximately 5 days, the longest captivity to that point. Berdella's logs from this period revealed his increasing sophistication in keeping victims alive while maximizing suffering. Ferris endured repeated electrical shocks applied to his genitals using a transformer Berdella had modified specifically for this purpose. The voltage was carefully calibrated, strong enough to cause excruciating pain but not powerful enough to cause immediate death. Berdella would administer shocks, wait for Ferris to recover consciousness, then repeat the process. Between shock sessions, he would inject various substances, photograph the results, and record detailed observations about pain responses and stress positions. The logs revealed Berdella's clinical detachment. Subject exhibited strong resistance initially, applied chlorpromazine 100 milligrams. Vocalization ceased after drain cleaner application. Began positional stress testing. This language, sterile, scientific, demonstrated how completely Berdella had dehumanized his victims. They weren't people. They were specimens in experiments only he understood. Ferris eventually died from septic shock caused by massive internal infections. His immune system, compromised by days of trauma and chemical exposure, simply collapsed. Berdella dismembered him with the same methodical approach he had developed, wrapping body parts in plastic bags nestled inside trash bags, ensuring no leakage would alert sanitation workers. Ferris's remains rode to landfills in garbage trucks, scattered across Kansas City's waste stream, unidentifiable and unrecoverable. Larry Wayne Pearson, 21, became the fifth victim in June 1987. Pearson had been briefly involved with Berdella romantically, a relationship that soured but left Pearson willing to visit Berdella's home when invited. This established connection made Pearson's subsequent disappearance even more tragic. He trusted someone he shouldn't have, believing previous familiarity provided some measure of safety. Pearson's torture extended approximately 6 weeks, making his ordeal the longest documented captivity in Berdella's House of Horrors. This extended time frame revealed Berdella's evolving methodology. He had learned how to keep victims alive longer, stretching out the suffering, maximizing his control and their degradation. The photographic evidence from Pearson's captivity showed systematic deterioration. Early images captured terror and struggling. Later photographs revealed someone who had mentally departed, eyes vacant, body emaciated, all resistance extinguished. During Pearson's captivity, Berdella employed his full arsenal of torture techniques. Repeated chemical injections caused massive tissue damage and abscesses throughout Pearson's body. Electrical shocks became daily occurrences. Berdella experimented with stress positions, keeping Pearson restrained in uncomfortable poses for hours, documenting muscle fatigue and psychological breakdown. He withheld food and water arbitrarily, creating additional psychological torture through unpredictability. The logs from this period revealed Berdella's satisfaction with his refinements. Subject survival extended significantly, infection management critical, antibiotics administered to prevent premature expiration. Control total. These notes demonstrated calculated cruelty. Berdella was using medical knowledge not to heal but to prolong agony, keeping his victims at the razor's edge between life and death for as long as possible. Pearson finally died from a combination of organ failure and massive infection. His body, traumatized beyond any capacity for recovery, simply shut down system by system. Berdella dismembered him, and Pearson's remains disappeared into Kansas City's garbage infrastructure. Another young life reduced to biological waste scattered across landfills. Christopher Bryson, 18, vanished in April 1988. Bryson represented Berdella's sixth confirmed victim and demonstrated his willingness to target increasingly younger victims. Bryson was a friend of Berdella's neighbors and had performed odd jobs around the Charlotte Street property. When Berdella offered him work and invited him inside, Bryson accepted without hesitation. The friendly neighborhood vendor seemed completely trustworthy. Bryson's captivity lasted approximately 4 days, during which Berdella subjected him to his entire methodological toolkit. The photographic evidence from Bryson's torture showed particularly horrific escalation. Berdella's sadism had intensified with experience, each victim teaching him new ways to inflict suffering. Bryson received chemical injections that caused severe necrosis in his neck and shoulder tissues. Electrical torture scarred his genitals and inner thighs. Objects inserted into his body caused internal hemorrhaging and septic infections. Berdella's logs from Bryson's captivity revealed increasingly disturbing language. Young subject shows interesting stress responses. Vocalization removal successful first attempt. Electrical application produces optimal fear responses. Considering extended timeline. These notes suggested Berdella was planning to keep Bryson alive even longer than Pearson, refining his techniques towards some perfect implementation of prolonged torture. However, Bryson died more quickly than Berdella anticipated. The trauma proved too severe, and Bryson's system failed after 4 days. Berdella expressed frustration in his logs. Subject expired prematurely. Need to recalibrate drug dosages. Even in noting a human death, Berdella's concern focused only on technical refinement, treating the extinguishment of life as merely an experimental setback requiring adjustment. Bryson's dismembered remains followed the now-established disposal pattern: plastic bags inside trash bags, distributed across collection days, vanishing into Kansas City's waste management system. His family filed missing persons reports, but like previous victims, Bryson seemed to have simply vanished without trace. Throughout this period, Berdella maintained his public persona flawlessly. He operated Bob's Bizarre Bazaar without interruption, chatting pleasantly with customers, discussing art and culture, presenting as a quirky but harmless eccentric. Neighbors saw him tending his yard, taking out trash, living an apparently normal life. Nobody suspected that the garbage bags he placed curbside contained human remains, that the basement of his ordinary-looking house held horrors beyond imagining. This dichotomy, friendly shopkeeper by day, sadistic torturer by night, revealed Berdella's most terrifying characteristic: his ability to completely compartmentalize, to maintain normal social functioning while conducting systematic atrocities. He wasn't driven by uncontrollable impulses. His crimes were methodical, planned, and executed with cold calculation. The monster and the man coexisted seamlessly, making him far more dangerous than impulsive killers who might eventually make obvious mistakes. By early 1988, Robert Berdella had achieved a grotesque mastery over his sadistic craft. 6 young men had disappeared into his Charlotte Street residence, enduring unspeakable torments before dying and being disposed of like refuse. Berdella's confidence had swelled to dangerous proportions. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that his methodologies were perfect, that he could continue indefinitely without consequence. This hubris would prove his undoing. Christopher Bryson's death in April 1988 left Berdella's basement empty for only weeks before his compulsion demanded another victim. The cooling-off periods between kills had shortened dramatically, suggesting escalating need, increasing addiction to the power and control his torture chamber provided. By summer 1988, Berdella was actively hunting again, prowling locations where vulnerable young men gathered. Robert Sheldon, not to be confused with the 1985 victim of the same first name, was a 22-year-old male prostitute working Kansas City streets. He advertised his services, and Berdella contacted him, arranging a meeting on July 5, 1988. Sheldon arrived at the Charlotte Street house expecting a standard transaction. Instead, he became victim number 7, though unlike the previous 6, Sheldon would not die in that basement. His survival would ultimately expose Berdella's entire murderous enterprise. The initial pattern followed established precedent. Berdella offered before leaving, he secured Sheldon with restraints he believed were escape-proof, administered sedatives to keep him compliant, and departed, confident his victim would remain exactly where he left him. Berdella had made a critical miscalculation. The sedative dosage was insufficient for Sheldon's metabolism, or perhaps Sheldon's desperate will to survive counteracted the drug's effects. Whatever the reason, Sheldon regained enough consciousness and motor control to begin working against his restraints. The hours Berdella was absent became Sheldon's window of salvation. Working with trembling fingers, fighting drug-induced disorientation and the screaming pain from his injuries, Sheldon managed to loosen one restraint. That single success cascaded. One hand free allowed him to work other bindings, and gradually, impossibly, Sheldon freed himself. Naked, bleeding, traumatized beyond description, he faced another challenge: escaping the house itself. The basement layout became crucial. Berdella had soundproofed it but not converted it into an impenetrable fortress. Sheldon found the stairs, climbed them, and discovered the door unlocked. Berdella's confidence had made him careless. Sheldon entered the main house, confronting another barrier: windows visible from the street. Appearing naked and bloodied would require explanation, might cause delays that would prove fatal if Berdella returned. But Sheldon had moved beyond caring about appearances or consequences beyond immediate survival. He approached a second-story window, opened it, and leaned out, screaming for help with his damaged vocal cords. The raspy, desperate sounds attracted attention from a neighbor who looked up and saw something that would haunt them permanently. A naked young man, covered in blood and obvious injuries, hanging from a window and begging for rescue. The neighbor immediately called 911. Within minutes, Kansas City police officers arrived at 4315 Charlotte Street. They found Sheldon in the window, barely coherent but emphatic that he had been tortured and held captive. Officers entered the residence cautiously, unsure what they might encounter. What they discovered exceeded their worst imagination odds and would become legendary in law enforcement circles for its sheer horror. The basement revealed itself as something from nightmare dimensions. Restraints hung from walls and ceiling. A stained mattress occupied the center of the room. Tables held syringes, bottles of chemicals, electrical equipment modified for torture, and instruments whose purposes were immediately and sickeningly apparent. Bloodstains, some fresh, others older, marked walls and floor. The air itself seemed contaminated with suffering. But the most damning evidence came from other areas of the house. Police discovered Berdella's logs, detailed, dated, clinical records of torture sessions spanning years. They found hundreds of Polaroid photographs documenting systematic brutalization of multiple victims in various stages of suffering and decay. They found human skulls displayed as trophies. They found vertebrae and other skeletal remains incorporated into the house as if they were mere decorative objects. As investigators processed the scene, the magnitude of what they had uncovered became increasingly clear. This wasn't a single assault or even a typical murder scene. They had discovered a sustained campaign of torture and killing spanning at least 4 years, possibly longer. The evidence suggested at least 6 victims besides Sheldon, possibly more whose remains hadn't been recovered or whose torture Berdella hadn't documented. Robert Berdella returned to his Charlotte Street house that afternoon to find it surrounded by police vehicles and emergency responders. His carefully constructed double life had collapsed in a single morning because one victim possessed the extraordinary courage and determination to escape. Berdella was immediately arrested, his expression reportedly showing more surprise than remorse, as if he couldn't comprehend how his perfect system had failed. Sheldon was rushed to a hospital where medical personnel struggled to document the extent of his injuries. Chemical burns covered his neck and shoulders. Electrical burns marked his genitals and thighs. Internal injuries caused by inserted objects required surgical intervention. Beyond physical trauma, the psychological damage was immeasurable. Sheldon had endured 4 days of systematic torture designed to destroy human spirit and identity. His recovery would be long and complicated, marked by nightmares, PTSD, and the permanent knowledge of how close he came to becoming another disappeared person. Another victim whose remains were never found. Yet Sheldon had survived, and his survival meant that Robert Berdella would finally face consequences for the monstrous acts he had committed in his basement chamber of horrors. The investigation that followed Christopher Sheldon's escape transformed Kansas City Police Department's Homicide Division into something resembling a wartime trauma unit. Detectives who had worked murders for decades found themselves unprepared for the meticulous documentation of suffering contained in Berdella's house. The photographs alone, over 300 of them, provided evidence so disturbing that viewing sessions required mandatory breaks and psychological counseling for investigators. Robert Berdella was formally charged initially with assault, felonious restraint, and various drug-related offenses connected to Christopher Sheldon's captivity. However, as investigators combed through the evidence recovered from 4315 Charlotte Street, additional charges accumulated rapidly. The human skulls, the skeletal remains, the photographic evidence of multiple victims, and Berdella's own detailed logs pointed inexorably towards serial murder on a scale Kansas City had never encountered. Facing overwhelming evidence and likely death penalty prosecution, Berdella made a calculated decision. He would cooperate with authorities, providing detailed confessions in exchange for avoiding execution. This cooperation would prove both invaluable and horrifying, as Berdella walked investigators through his crimes with the same clinical detachment his logs had displayed. His confessions confirmed 6 murders: Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, Walter James Ferris, Larry Wayne Pearson, and Christopher Bryson. For each victim, Berdella provided detailed accounts of their capture, torture, death, and disposal. He explained his methodologies, his refinements over time, his experiments with different drugs and torture techniques. He described dismemberment processes with butcher-like terminology, discussing which tools worked best for severing joints and cutting through bone. The level of detail Berdella provided served multiple purposes. For investigators, it answered questions about missing persons cases and provided closure for families. For prosecutors, it demonstrated premeditation and methodical planning that countered any insanity defense. For the public, it revealed depths of human cruelty that challenged fundamental assumptions about neighbors and community members. Berdella's descriptions of his victims' suffering were particularly difficult for everyone involved. He explained how he would calculate drug dosages to keep victims conscious but helpless, maximizing their awareness of ongoing torture. He described the satisfaction he derived from complete control over another person's existence. He discussed his photographic documentation as if describing any hobbyist's collection rather than archives of human agony. When asked about motivation, Berdella provided explanations that mixed sexual sadism with power dynamics and a twisted sense of collecting. He compared keeping victims to collecting artifacts for his shop. They were objects to be acquired, utilized, and eventually disposed of when they no longer served his purposes. This objectification was so complete that Berdella seemed genuinely puzzled by why anyone would consider his actions particularly problematic beyond their illegality. The prosecution faced unusual challenges despite overwhelming evidence. Berdella's willingness to confess in exchange for avoiding execution meant constructing a plea agreement that satisfied justice while accepting the reality that Kansas hadn't executed anyone in decades and courts were increasingly reluctant to impose death sentences. Prosecutors determined that multiple life sentences without possibility of parole would effectively accomplish the same goal while avoiding years of appeals. On December 19, 1988, Robert Berdella pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder, Larry Pearson, and 4 counts of second-degree murder, Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, and Walter James Ferris. He later pleaded guilty to 1 additional count of first-degree murder, Christopher Bryson, in 1989. The plea agreements resulted in life imprisonment without possibility of parole, with sentences to be served consecutively, ensuring Berdella would never experience freedom again. The courtroom proceedings provided some measure of closure for victims' families, though nothing could truly compensate for their losses. Mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends confronted the man who had stolen their loved ones and subjected them to unimaginable suffering. Victim impact statements painted portraits of young men with futures, dreams, and people who loved them, countering Berdella's dehumanizing objectification. Berdella showed minimal emotional response throughout proceedings. He answered questions matter-of-factly, acknowledged his guilt without apparent remorse, and accepted his sentences with resignation rather than visible regret. This emotional flatness disturbed observers more than dramatic displays might have. It suggested someone fundamentally disconnected from normal human empathy and conscience. Christopher Sheldon, the survivor whose escape had exposed everything, faced his own complicated journey. While his testimony wasn't required due to Berdella's guilty pleas, he provided statements to investigators and later spoke about his experiences. The trauma of his 4-day captivity would affect him permanently, but he also carried knowledge that his survival had stopped Berdella from claiming additional victims. How many lives did Sheldon's escape ultimately save? The question haunted him but also provided some meaning within horror. Berdella entered the Missouri prison system in 1989, housed in maximum security facilities appropriate for high-profile murderers. His notoriety preceded him. Fellow inmates and corrections officers knew exactly who he was and what he had done. Prison culture has its own justice system for certain types of offenders, and Berdella's crimes placed him in a particularly vulnerable category. He spent his incarceration largely isolated, whether by choice or necessity. He continued drawing and creating art, though prison authorities monitored his work for disturbing content. He gave occasional interviews to psychologists and criminologists studying serial killers, providing additional insights into his pathology. These interviews revealed a man who intellectually understood that society condemned his actions but who seemed incapable of emotional comprehension of why torture and murder were wrong beyond abstract legal principles. The final chapter of Robert Berdella's story concluded unexpectedly on October 8, 1992. Guards conducting routine checks discovered him unresponsive in his cell at the Missouri State Penitentiary. Medical personnel attempted resuscitation, but Berdella was pronounced dead shortly after. The official cause of death was determined to be a heart attack, myocardial infarction brought on by coronary artery disease. He was 43 years old. His death generated mixed responses. Some victims' families expressed relief that the man who had tormented their loved ones had himself ceased to exist. Others felt cheated of the justice represented by Berdella spending decades more imprisoned, experiencing a fraction of the suffering he had inflicted. Still others felt nothing. No amount of punishment or death could return their murdered family members or erase what had been done to them. The Kansas City community struggled with Berdella's legacy. How had such monstrous acts occurred for years without detection? What failures of social awareness, law enforcement, or community connection had allowed vulnerable young men to disappear without triggering adequate investigation? These questions prompted uncomfortable self-examination and led to reforms in how missing persons cases, particularly those involving transient populations, were handled. The house at 4315 Charlotte Street became a grim tourist attraction briefly before the city demolished it in 1993. Too many people were drawn to the site, seeking macabre connection to notorious crimes. The property sat vacant for years afterward, as if the ground itself remained contaminated by what had occurred there. Eventually, new construction replaced the empty lot, but longtime residents remembered what had stood there and what horrors its basement had contained. Forensic psychologists and criminologists continue studying the Berdella case for insights into serial killer psychology and methodology. His detailed logs and photographic documentation provided rare first-person accounts of a killer's thought processes and evolving techniques. This evidence, while disturbing, has contributed to improved criminal profiling and investigation methodologies. The victims, Jerry Howell, Robert Sheldon, Mark Wallace, Walter James Ferris, Larry Wayne Pearson, and Christopher Bryson, deserve remembrance as human beings rather than merely statistics in a serial killer's tally. They were sons, brothers, friends. They had aspirations, humor, talents, and the right to lives that were stolen from them through calculated cruelty. Their family's grief continues, though decades have passed. Christopher Sheldon's survival remains central to the case's resolution. Without his extraordinary courage and determination to escape, Berdella might have continued killing indefinitely. The evidence in his house might never have been discovered, or might have been destroyed before his eventual apprehension. Sheldon's willingness to endure 4 days of torture while remaining mentally intact enough to seize an escape opportunity saved unknowable numbers of potential future victims. The Berdella case forces confrontation with uncomfortable realities about human nature and societal vulnerabilities. Monsters exist, often hiding behind ordinary appearances and friendly personas. Vulnerable populations face increased danger precisely because their disappearances generate less attention and investigation. Evil doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it operates quietly, methodically, behind closed doors on ordinary residential streets. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was not a supernatural demon or inexplicable aberration. He was a human being who made conscious choices to inflict suffering and death on other human beings for his own gratification. Understanding that such capacity exists within human psychology, is disturbing but necessary. Only through understanding can society develop better protection mechanisms, improved investigation techniques, and enhanced support for vulnerable populations. The legacy of those weeks and months in 1988, when Berdella's crimes were exposed, remains active in criminal justice reform, victim advocacy, and public awareness. The case serves as a brutal reminder that vigilance matters, that community connection matters, that every missing person deserves thorough investigation regardless of their social circumstances. For decades later, the name Robert Berdella still provokes visceral reactions among those familiar with his crimes. He earned his place among America's most notorious serial killers not through victim count alone, but through the systematic, methodical nature of his torture and the clinical documentation of suffering he maintained. His basement chamber represented evil distilled to its essence, the complete reduction of human beings to objects existing solely for another's sadistic pleasure. The story concludes with his death in prison, but the trauma he inflicted extends far beyond his lifespan. Families still grieve. Christopher Sheldon still carries scars both visible and psychological. Kansas City still remembers that evil lived undetected on Charlotte Street for years. These reverberations ensure that while Robert Berdella himself is gone, the horror he created remains etched permanently in criminal history and in the nightmares of those who encountered his work. May the victims rest in peace. May their families find whatever healing remains possible. And may society never forget that behind ordinary facades, unimaginable darkness sometimes lurks, waiting for opportunity and vulnerable prey. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.